The howl tore through the forest before Elena even reached the training ground, and her heart jumped into her throat. She had heard many howls in her life, but never one like this. It was not a warning. It was not a call to gather. It was something raw and searching, as if the wolf behind it was looking for someone it had lost a long time ago. She stopped at the edge of the trees, her breath catching in the cold morning air. The Blackthorn pack grounds stretched out before her, rows of wooden cabins and open fields, where warriors trained every day before sunrise. But today felt different. Today the air itself seemed to hum with tension, the kind that made the hair on her arms stand up. Elena pulled her cloak tighter and stepped out from the shadows. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the pack, and Omegas did not draw attention to themselves. She had learned that lesson early, when she was still a child and her parents had died in a border skirmish, leaving her to be raised by the pack rather than by a family of her own. Since then, she had kept her head down, done her work, and stayed invisible. But invisibility was hard to maintain when the entire pack was buzzing with the same piece of news. The Alpha King was coming. Not just any Alpha King. Kellen Rourke, ruler of the 5 allied packs, the youngest king to ever hold the crown, and, according to the whispers that traveled faster than wind through the camp, a man whose wolf had never once bonded with anyone. Some said his wolf was too powerful to accept a mate. Others said he simply had not found the right one. Either way, his arrival at Blackthorn was the biggest event the pack had seen in years. Elena had no reason to care. Kings did not notice Omegas. Kings noticed warriors, healers, and daughters of noble bloodlines, women who could strengthen alliances and secure borders. She was none of those things. She was a seamstress who mended torn cloaks and stitched wounds when the healer was too busy, a girl who ate her meals alone and slept in the smallest cabin at the edge of the camp. She told herself this as she walked toward the training ground that morning, carrying a basket of freshly mended clothes to deliver to the guards. She told herself this even as her feet slowed at the sight of the crowd gathering near the main gate. The King's Guard arrived first, a line of tall men and women in dark leather, their eyes sharp and alert. Behind them came more warriors, and then, finally, a lone figure on a black horse, moving at an unhurried pace, as though the whole world existed simply to wait for him. Kellen Rourke was not what Elena expected. She had imagined someone older, someone hardened by years of rule, his face carved into permanent sternness. Instead, she saw a man who could not have been more than 28 years old, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. He wore no crown, no ornate robes, only a simple black coat that somehow made him look more powerful than any jewel could have. He dismounted in one smooth motion, and the entire training ground fell silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Elena knew she should look away. Staring at the Alpha King was not something an Omega did, but something kept her eyes fixed on him, some pull she could not explain, and just as she thought to finally break the moment and turn back toward her work, his gaze swept across the crowd and landed directly on her. For one heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Elena felt it before she understood it, a jolt that ran through her chest like lightning, as if something inside her had been asleep for years and had suddenly opened its eyes. Kellen's expression shifted, just slightly, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing, as though he too had felt something impossible. Then one of his guards said something to him, and he blinked, breaking the connection, turning his attention back to the pack elders who had come forward to greet him. The moment was gone as quickly as it had come, but Elena's hands were shaking, and the basket of clothes nearly slipped from her arms. She hurried away before anyone could notice, ducking into the shadow of the nearest cabin, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What had just happened? She had never felt anything like it before, not with any man in the pack, not even in her dreams. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings looked at crowds all the time. His eyes had simply passed over her the way they passed over everyone else. It was foolish to think there was anything more to it. But as she stood there, catching her breath, she noticed something strange happening across the field. Kellen had gone still again, his head turned slightly in her direction, his nostrils flaring as though he were trying to catch a scent on the wind. One of the elders spoke to him, and he answered, but his eyes kept drifting back toward the cabins, toward the exact spot where she stood hidden in the shadows. He could not possibly see her from there, and yet she had the distinct feeling that he knew exactly where she was. The day passed in a blur of nervous energy. The pack prepared a feast in honor of the king's visit, and Elena was assigned to help in the kitchens, chopping vegetables and carrying trays, grateful for the distraction of hard work. She told herself repeatedly that the strange moment at the gate had been nothing, a trick of the light, a coincidence born of her own tired mind. But when evening came, and the great hall filled with warriors and nobles celebrating the king's arrival, Elena found herself glancing toward the head table more often than she should have. Kellen sat among the pack elders, nodding politely at their words, but his eyes kept drifting away from the conversation, scanning the room as though searching for something. She was serving drinks that night, moving quietly between tables, careful to keep her eyes down as she had been taught. When she reached the head table, her hands trembled slightly as she poured wine into the king's cup. She kept her gaze fixed on the pitcher, refusing to look up, refusing to give in to the strange pull she had felt earlier. "Thank you," Kellen said quietly. His voice was low, warm, and it sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Elena managed a small nod, still not looking at him, and turned to leave. But as she stepped away, she felt his eyes on her back, steady and unwavering, and she knew without turning around that he was watching her walk away. She did not sleep well that night. In her small cabin at the edge of the camp, she lay awake long after the celebration had ended, staring at the wooden ceiling above her bed, replaying the strange moment at the gate over and over in her mind. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself kings did not notice omegas, that whatever she had felt was simply nerves, simply the excitement of the day. But deep down, in a place she did not want to examine too closely, she knew that was not the whole truth. Sometime past midnight, exhaustion finally pulled her under, and she found herself in a dream unlike any she had experienced before. She was standing in a moonlit forest, the trees tall and silver, the air thick with the scent of pine, and something else, something warm and familiar that she could not name. In the distance, she heard a wolf's howl, low and mournful, calling out into the night. She began to walk toward the sound, drawn forward by a force she could not resist, her bare feet moving silently over the soft forest floor. The howl came again, closer this time, and beneath it, she thought she heard something else, a voice, faint and distant, whispering a single word. "Elena." She woke with a gasp, sitting upright in her bed, her heart racing, the dream already fading at the edges like smoke. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself it had only been a dream. But the sound of that voice, calling her name in the darkness, stayed with her, long after the sun rose over the camp. She did not see Kellen again until 3 days later. The pack had returned to its normal routines, though the excitement of the king's visit still lingered in every conversation. Elena had thrown herself into her work, mending cloaks and dresses, helping in the kitchens, doing everything she could to keep her mind occupied, and away from thoughts of storm-gray eyes and dreams she could not explain. She was walking along the edge of the training ground one afternoon, a basket of mended uniforms balanced on her hip, when she rounded a corner and nearly collided with someone coming from the opposite direction. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, stepping back and lowering her eyes out of habit. "No harm done." That voice, she knew it instantly, and her head snapped up before she could stop herself. Kellen stood before her, dressed simply in training clothes, his dark hair damp with sweat, as though he had just finished sparring with his guards. Up close, he was even more striking than she remembered, his gray eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. "Your Majesty," she said, quickly lowering her head again, and stepping to the side to let him pass. But he did not move. "What is your name?" he asked. The question caught her completely off guard. Kings did not ask Omegas their names. She hesitated, unsure if she was even permitted to answer, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed the exchange. The training ground was mostly empty at this hour, only a few warriors sparring in the distance, none of them paying attention to the king and the Omega girl standing near the fence. "Elena," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something flickered across his face when she said it, a strange mixture of recognition and relief, as though her name confirmed something he had already suspected. "Elena," he repeated softly, testing the word on his tongue. "Is there something you need, Your Majesty?" she asked, desperate to break the strange tension building between them. Kellen was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face as though he were trying to solve a puzzle. I felt something, he finally said, his voice low, almost reluctant. When I arrived. At the gate. Did you feel it too? Elena's heart stopped. She wanted to deny it, wanted to claim ignorance, and hurry away before this conversation went any further, but something in his eyes told her that lying would be pointless. He already knew the answer. I don't know what I felt, she admitted quietly. But yes, something happened. Kellen exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment, he looked less like a king and more like an ordinary young man, uncertain and slightly overwhelmed. My wolf has never reacted to anyone the way he reacted to you, he said. Not once, in all my years as alpha. I thought perhaps it was nothing, a trick of the moment, but it has not faded. What does that mean? Elena asked, though some part of her already feared the answer. I don't know yet, Kellen said honestly, but I intend to find out. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both step apart. One of the pack elders appeared around the corner, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of the king standing so close to an Omega girl. Kellen straightened immediately, his expression smoothing into practiced neutrality. Your Majesty, the council awaits you, the elder said, his voice polite, but his gaze lingering suspiciously on Elena. Of course, Kellen said. He glanced back at Elena one final time, his eyes holding a promise she did not yet understand. We will speak again, Elena. Then he was gone, following the elder back toward the main hall, leaving Elena standing alone by the fence, her basket of mended uniforms forgotten at her feet, her mind spinning with questions she had no answers to. That night, the dream returned, more vivid than before. She stood again in the silver forest, the moonlight bathing everything in a soft glow, and this time, when the howl echoed through the trees, she saw him. A great wolf, black as midnight, with eyes the color of storm clouds, standing just beyond the tree line, watching her, with an intensity that mirrored the way Kellen had looked at her that afternoon. The wolf did not approach, it simply stood there, its gaze locked with hers, and when it finally spoke, the voice was unmistakably his. Elena. She woke before dawn, her body trembling, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever was happening between her and the Alpha King, it was only just beginning. Somewhere deep inside her, a small, frightened voice whispered that nothing about this could end simply. Omegas did not become anything to kings. Laws existed to prevent exactly what she feared was starting to grow inside her chest. A warmth she had no right to feel, a longing she could not explain. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, she could not stop herself from wondering what it would be like if the impossible were somehow allowed to happen. She pushed the thought away as quickly as it came, reminding herself of everything she was and everything she was not. Yet even as she closed her eyes and tried to force herself back to sleep, she could still hear it, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind, like a promise neither of them had chosen to make. Elena. The wolf was calling her name, and some part of her, the part she tried hardest to silence, was already answering back. Morning came too quickly. Elena rose before the sun, as she always did, and busied herself with chores in an attempt to outrun her own thoughts. She fetched water from the well, folded linens for the healer's cabin, and swept the front step of her small home, all while her mind kept circling back to the same storm-gray eyes that had followed her into her dreams. She was not the only one whose sleep had been disturbed. Across the camp, in the guest quarters reserved for visiting nobles, Kellen sat by the window of his room, staring out at the dark shapes of the trees, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin. He had ruled for 6 years. He had faced border disputes, rival packs, and council members who doubted his youth. None of it had ever unsettled him the way one quiet Omega girl had unsettled him in the span of a single glance. He told himself it was simply unusual, a rare reaction, perhaps caused by exhaustion from travel, or the stress of managing 5 packs at once. Alphas sometimes experienced heightened senses when they were tired, he reasoned. It did not have to mean anything more than that. But his wolf did not agree. Every time he tried to push the thought of her aside, the wolf clawed back to the surface, restless and insistent, filling his mind with the sound of her voice, the shape of her face when she had finally looked up at him, startled and unguarded. It was not something Kellen could simply reason away, no matter how hard he tried. He rose before dawn and went to the training ground alone, hoping the familiar rhythm of sparring might quiet the storm inside him. He drew his sword and moved through familiar forms, muscles remembering movements his mind could not focus on. Sweat slid down his back as the exercise dragged on, but nothing eased the pull he felt, as though some invisible thread connected him to a small cabin at the edge of the camp, tugging gently with every breath he took. It was foolish, he told himself. He was the Alpha King. He had responsibilities that stretched far beyond his own feelings, alliances to protect, treaties to uphold, a kingdom that depended on him making wise decisions rather than following the demands of instinct. And yet, for the first time in his life, instinct felt louder than duty. Later that day, the council gathered to discuss the reason for his visit, a border dispute between Blackthorn and a neighboring pack that had been growing more tense in recent months. Kellen sat at the head of the table, listening as the elders argued back and forth, offering his input when needed, projecting the calm authority his position demanded. But his attention kept drifting, his mind wandering back to a pair of quiet brown eyes and a voice that had trembled slightly when she said her own name. One of the elders, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret who had served the pack for decades, noticed his distraction more than once. She said nothing during the meeting, but as the council began to disperse, she lingered near the door, watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "Your Majesty seems troubled," she said carefully, once the room had emptied. "I am simply tired," Kellen replied, keeping his tone even. Margaret studied him a moment longer, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I saw you speaking with one of our Omegas yesterday. Elena, the seamstress." Kellen's expression did not change, though something inside him tightened at the mention of her name. "I asked her a simple question, nothing more." "Of course," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she did not fully believe him. "Forgive me for saying so, Your Majesty, but it would be unwise for a king to show particular interest in an Omega. The council would not look favorably upon it, and neither, I imagine, would your intended alliance with the Ashwood pack." The mention of an alliance caught Kellen off guard. What alliance? Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, as though surprised he did not already know. "Forgive me. I assumed the elders had informed you. There has been talk of strengthening ties between our kingdom and Ashwood through marriage. Their eldest daughter, Seraphina, has long been considered a suitable match." Kellen felt something cold settle in his chest at the words, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. He had heard vague mentions of political marriages before, the way any ruler eventually did, but he had never taken them seriously, always assuming there would be time to address such matters later. Apparently, the council did not share his patience. "I have made no commitments," he said firmly. "Not yet," Margaret agreed, "but I would advise caution, Your Majesty. Whatever occurred at the gate yesterday, whatever strange pull you may have felt, it would be wise to remember your responsibilities before you allow instinct to guide your actions." She left without waiting for a response, her words hanging heavy in the air long after she had gone. Kellen remained in the empty council room, staring at the wooden table before him, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. He had never asked for a bond. He had never asked for his wolf to react so violently to a stranger he had known for less than a day, and yet here he was, unable to stop thinking about her, unable to silence the voice inside him that insisted she mattered, that she was somehow different from every other person he had ever met. He thought of the alliance Margaret had mentioned, the daughter of Ashwood he had never even met, and felt nothing but a distant, hollow obligation. He thought of Elena, of the way her eyes had widened when he asked her name, and felt something entirely different, something warm and urgent that refused to be reasoned away. That evening, unable to settle his restless thoughts, Kellen left the guest quarters and walked the edge of the camp alone, his guards trailing at a respectful distance. The night air was cool and quiet, broken only by the distant sound of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. He was not entirely sure what he was looking for, or why his feet carried him toward the cluster of small cabins at the camp's edge, but he did not fight the pull. He saw her before she saw him, sitting alone on the step of her cabin, wrapped in a worn blanket, staring up at the stars. The moonlight caught the edges of her dark hair, and for a moment, Kellen simply stood there, watching her, struck by how ordinary the scene was, and how extraordinary it felt to witness it. Elena must have sensed him. because she turned suddenly, her eyes widening when she saw him standing at the edge of the clearing. She rose quickly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, uncertain whether she should bow or speak, or simply wait for him to explain his presence. "I didn't mean to startle you," Kellen said, stepping closer, though he kept a respectful distance between them. "It's late for a king to be wandering the camp alone," Elena said carefully. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. It was the truth, though he was not sure why he felt compelled to share it with her. Elena hesitated, glancing toward the guards standing at the edge of the clearing, before looking back at him. "Neither could I." Something about the simplicity of her honesty made Kellen smile, a small, genuine expression that few people ever saw from him. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing toward the step beside her. She glanced nervously toward the guards again, clearly aware of how improper the situation would look to anyone who saw it. But after a moment, she nodded, moving slightly to make room for him. Kellen sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, careful to keep a respectful distance. For a while, neither of them spoke, both simply staring up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. It was Elena who finally broke the silence. "Is it true," she asked quietly, "that there is talk of an alliance? With Ashwood?" Kellen's jaw tightened slightly, surprised that word had already reached her. "Where did you hear that?" "The pack is small," Elena said simply. "News travels fast, even to Omegas." Kellen sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There has been talk. Nothing has been decided. But it will be, eventually," Elena said, not quite a question. He did not answer immediately, and his silence told her everything she needed to know. Elena looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, and tried to ignore the strange ache that settled in her chest at the thought of him marrying someone else, someone chosen by the council, someone who was not her. It was a foolish thing to feel. She had known him for barely 2 days. Whatever strange connection existed between them, it did not erase the reality of who they were, a king bound by duty, and an Omega bound by law. But knowing this did nothing to ease the quiet sadness pressing against her ribs. "I should return to my quarters," Kellen finally said, rising to his feet, though he made no move to leave immediately. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Elena, whatever this is, whatever my wolf seems to want, I cannot promise you anything. My duty comes first, it has to." "I understand," Elena said quietly, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Kellen nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the guest quarters, his guards falling into step behind him. Elena watched him go, the warmth of his presence fading into the cold night air, and only when he disappeared from sight did she allow herself to release the breath she had been holding. She did not know what the future held, or how two people from such different worlds could ever find a way toward each other. But as she climbed back into bed that night, the wolf's voice returned once more in her dreams, closer now, more insistent, calling her name through the silver trees, as though it refused to let her go. "Elena." And for the first time, in the depths of sleep where honesty came easier than in waking hours, she allowed herself to answer. "I hear you." Days passed, and the camp settled back into its familiar rhythm, though Elena could no longer pretend her world had not shifted. She threw herself into her work, with even more determination than before, mending torn fabric until her fingers ached, hoping the exhaustion might quiet the restless energy humming beneath her skin. It did not work. Every time she closed her eyes, even for a moment, she saw storm-gray eyes watching her, patient and unblinking, waiting for something she did not yet understand. Kellen had not sought her out again since that night on the cabin step, and Elena told herself this was for the best. He had responsibilities. She had her place. Whatever strange pull existed between them, it did not change the fact that an Alpha King and an Omega seamstress belonged to entirely different worlds, worlds that were never meant to touch. Still, she could not stop herself from glancing toward the guest quarters whenever she passed near them, could not stop the small flutter in her chest whenever she caught sight of dark hair, or a familiar broad-shouldered figure moving among the pack elders. She hated how much power he seemed to hold over her thoughts without even trying. One morning, while delivering a basket of mended clothes to the healer's cabin, Elena overheard two of the older women speaking in hushed voices near the well. She was not trying to listen, but their words carried easily on the quiet morning air, and she found herself slowing her steps despite herself. They say the elders are pushing hard for the match with Ashwood, one woman said. Serafina arrives within the week to formalize things, or so I've heard. About time, the other replied. A king needs a proper mate, someone who understands duty, not some passing fascination. Elena's stomach twisted painfully at the words, though she kept walking, refusing to let her steps falter. She told herself it did not matter. She had known from the very beginning that nothing could come from whatever strange connection she shared with Kellen. Hearing it confirmed by strangers should not have hurt as much as it did. But it did hurt, sharp and unexpected, settling deep in her chest like a stone she could not shake loose. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind wandered elsewhere. By the time evening arrived, she found herself standing at the edge of the training ground once more, staring toward the distant guest quarters, where torchlight flickered behind curtained windows. She did not know what she was hoping to see. Perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps she simply wanted to feel close to him, even from a distance, before the arrival of Serafina made any such closeness impossible. She did not notice Kellen approaching until he was standing right beside her. "You seem far away," he said quietly, startling her out of her thoughts. Elena straightened quickly, smoothing the front of her dress out of habit. "Your Majesty, I didn't hear you approach." "Kellen," he corrected gently. "When it's just us, you may call me Kellen." She hesitated, unsure if such familiarity was wise, given everything she had heard that morning. "I heard," she began carefully, "that Serafina arrives soon." Something flickered across his face, a shadow of frustration quickly masked. "The council has arranged it. Yes, she arrives within the week, to discuss the terms of an alliance." "Terms of marriage, you mean?" Elena said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Kellen sighed, running a hand through his hair in the gesture she had already come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "Nothing has been decided. The council pushes, but the final choice remains mine." "Do you intend to refuse it?" Elena asked, hating how much she wanted to hear a particular answer, hating how much power his response held over her. Kellen was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, as though the answer to her question lived somewhere in her expression. "I don't know," he admitted finally. 6 days ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. The alliance makes sense. It would strengthen our borders and secure peace with Ashwood for generations. But now..." He did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. Elena felt her heart clench painfully in her chest, caught between hope and fear in equal measure. "You cannot build a kingdom on feelings that go against the law," she said quietly, forcing the words out even though every part of her wanted to say something entirely different. "Whatever this is between us, it isn't allowed. You know that as well as I do." "I know what the law says," Kellen replied, his voice low and steady. "But my wolf does not care about laws written by men centuries ago. He knows what he wants, Elena, and he has never wanted anything the way he wants you." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded, and Elena found herself unable to look away from him, caught in the intensity of his gaze. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this conversation was dangerous, that continuing it could only lead to heartbreak for both of them. But another part of her, quieter and far more honest, simply wanted to close the distance between them, and finally understand what this strange, undeniable pull actually meant. "This can't happen," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," Kellen said softly, "but I don't know how to make it stop." Neither of them moved. The night air seemed to hold its breath around them, thick with unspoken words, and a tension that had been building since the very first moment their eyes had met at the gate. Elena's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it, and for a fleeting moment, she thought he might close the distance between them entirely. But the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. One of Kellen's guards appeared at the edge of the training ground, calling for his attention regarding some matter requiring his presence. Kellen closed his eyes briefly, visibly gathering himself, before turning to acknowledge the interruption. "I have to go," he said, though he made no immediate move to leave, his eyes lingering on her face, as though memorizing every detail. "Elena, whatever happens with the council, whatever decisions are made, I need you to know that none of this is what I want." "Then what do you want?" she asked quietly. He did not answer right away, and for a moment, Elena thought he might not answer at all. But finally, he took a small step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to know what it feels like to choose you, without a crown standing between us." Then he was gone, following his guard back toward the main hall, leaving Elena standing alone in the darkness, her heart racing, and her mind spinning with words she had never expected to hear from a king. She barely slept that night, and when she finally did drift into unconsciousness, the dream returned once more vivid and more painful than ever before. She stood in the silver forest as she always did, waiting for the familiar howl to echo through the trees. But this time, when the black wolf appeared at the tree line, it did not simply watch her from a distance. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another, closing the gap between them, with quiet, careful movements, as though afraid she might disappear if it moved too quickly. Elena did not run. She stood perfectly still, her heart pounding, as the wolf approached until it stood directly before her, close enough that she could see the intelligence burning in its storm-gray eyes. It lowered its great head slowly, and for a moment, she thought it might simply turn and walk away. Instead, it pressed its head gently against her palm, warm and solid beneath her fingers, and somewhere deep in her mind, she heard his voice again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Don't let them take you from me." She woke with tears on her cheeks, though she could not fully explain why. The dream had felt more real than any dream had a right to feel, and the ache it left behind lingered long after the sun rose over the camp. 3 days later, Serafina arrived. The pack gathered near the main gate to welcome her, much as they had gathered to welcome Kellen weeks earlier, though the atmosphere this time felt entirely different. Where Kellen's arrival had carried a sense of quiet awe, Serafina's entrance was accompanied by pageantry and ceremony, a long procession of Ashwood warriors and attendants moving through the gate with practiced elegance. Serafina herself rode at the front, and Elena had to admit, watching from the edge of the crowd, that the woman was undeniably beautiful. She had golden hair that caught the afternoon sunlight, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege and purpose. She was, in every visible way, exactly the kind of match a council would choose for a king. Elena felt small and insignificant, standing among the crowd, watching Serafina dismount gracefully and greet the pack elders with practiced charm. She told herself this confirmed everything she already knew, that whatever strange connection existed between herself and Kellen meant nothing in the face of duty and expectation. Serafina belonged in this world of alliances and crowns. Elena did not. She turned to leave before the ceremony concluded, unable to watch any longer, but as she made her way through the crowd, she caught sight of Kellen standing near the elders, greeting Serafina with polite formality. His expression was carefully neutral, the kind of practiced calm she recognized from council meetings, but as Elena passed at the edge of his vision, his eyes flickered briefly toward her, just for a moment, filled with an apology he could not voice aloud. Elena looked away first, forcing herself to keep walking, her chest tight with an ache she refused to name. Whatever had begun between them at the gate weeks earlier, whatever the dreams and the stolen moments had meant, it seemed the world had already decided how this story would end. But as she walked away, she could not shake the feeling that Kellen's wolf, wherever it existed inside him, was not nearly as willing to accept that ending as the rest of the world seemed to be. That night, the great hall overflowed with celebration in honor of Serafina's arrival. Musicians played in the corner, while pack members and Ashwood attendants mingled together, sharing food and wine beneath strings of glowing lanterns. Elena had been assigned once again to serve drinks, and though she moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her eyes kept drifting toward the head table, where Kellen sat beside Serafina, the two of them the picture of a matched pair, at least to anyone who did not know the truth hiding beneath the surface. Serafina laughed at something one of the elders said, her golden hair catching the lantern light, and Elena felt a fresh wave of quiet misery settle over her. She busied herself refilling cups, keeping her eyes down, determined not to let anyone see the way her hands trembled slightly whenever she came too close to the head table. "You there," a voice called, and Elena turned to find Serafina looking directly at her, an unreadable expression on her face. "More wine, if you please." "Of course, my lady," Elena murmured, stepping forward to fill the offered cup, careful to keep her gaze respectfully lowered. Serafina studied her for a moment longer than necessary, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Elena's plain dress and downcast expression. "What is your name?" Elena hesitated, glancing briefly toward Kellen before answering. His jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, though his expression otherwise remained carefully neutral. Elena, my lady. Elena, Serafina repeated, testing the name the same way Kellen had, weeks earlier, though her tone carried none of the warmth his had held. How interesting. My attendants mentioned a girl by that name when we arrived. They said the king seemed rather taken with her. The comment landed like a blow, and Elena felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and fear in equal measure. She opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came out, her mind racing to find some safe response that would not put either herself or Kellen in danger. Attendants gossip, Kellen said smoothly, cutting into the conversation before Elena could respond. It would be wise not to give idle talk more weight than it deserves. Serafina's eyes flickered toward him, something calculating passing behind her gaze before she smiled, smooth and practiced. Of course. Forgive me for the assumption. She turned back to Elena, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. You may go. Thank you for the wine. Elena bowed her head and hurried away as quickly as propriety allowed, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. She did not stop until she reached the kitchens, setting down her tray with trembling hands, trying to steady her breathing before anyone noticed her distress. She did not see the rest of the exchange between Kellen and Serafina, did not see the way Serafina's smile faded the moment Elena was out of sight, replaced by something colder and far more calculating. She did not see the way Serafina's eyes tracked Kellen's gaze as it drifted, just once, toward the kitchen doorway where Elena had disappeared. But she felt the weight of it regardless, a heavy sense of foreboding that settled over her for the rest of the evening, refusing to lift no matter how hard she tried to shake it. Something had shifted that night, some quiet, dangerous awareness that had not existed before Serafina's arrival. Elena did not know exactly what it meant, but she understood, with a certainty she could not explain, that the peaceful anonymity she had relied upon her entire life was no longer something she could count on. Later that night, long after the celebration had ended and the camp had settled into silence, Elena sat alone on the step of her cabin, staring up at the same stars she had shared with Kellen just days earlier. She thought about Serafina's cold, knowing smile, about the careful way Kellen had deflected the question, about the dangerous game they seemed to have stumbled into without ever choosing to play. She thought, too, about the words he had spoken before Serafina's arrival, the quiet confession that had lodged itself permanently in her chest. I want to know what it feels like to choose you, without a crown standing between us. It was a beautiful thought, and an impossible one. Elena understood that better than anyone. She had grown up watching the gap between Omegas and Nobles, had learned from a young age exactly where she belonged, and where she did not. Whatever Kellen's wolf wanted, whatever strange bond had formed between them in a matter of days, it could not erase centuries of law and expectation. And yet, as she sat beneath the stars that night, feeling the cool wind move through her hair, she could not stop the small, stubborn hope that had taken root somewhere deep inside her chest, refusing to be silenced, no matter how many reasons she gave herself to let it go. Somewhere across the camp, in the quiet of the guest quarters, Kellen stood by his window once more, staring out at the same stars, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin. Serafina's arrival had changed nothing about what he felt, had only clarified, with painful precision, exactly how impossible his situation had become. He thought of his father, who had ruled before him, always emphasizing duty above all else. He thought of the elders, who expected him to secure the kingdom's future through careful alliance, rather than reckless emotion. And he thought of Elena, sitting somewhere in the darkness beyond his window, carrying a piece of him that he had never intended to give away. He did not know how this would end, but as his wolf howled softly in the back of his mind, restless and unwilling to be silenced, Kellen understood that whatever choice lay ahead of him, it would not be an easy one, and it would not come without cost. The days that followed Serafina's arrival passed in a strange, uneasy rhythm. The camp buzzed with talk of the coming alliance, and though nothing had been formally announced, everyone seemed to speak of the match as though it were already settled. Elena heard the whispers everywhere she went, in the kitchens, at the well, among the seamstresses she worked alongside each day. She learned to keep her expression neutral, to nod along politely whenever someone mentioned how fortunate the pack was to be gaining such a strong alliance. all while a quiet ache settled deeper into her chest with each passing day. She had not spoken to Kellen since the night of the celebration. It was safer that way, she told herself. Serafina's sharp eyes seemed to be everywhere, and Elena had no desire to draw further suspicion toward either of them. She threw herself into her work instead, mending clothes late into the evening, exhausting herself enough that sleep came more easily, though the dreams never fully stopped. One afternoon, while delivering a basket of finished garments to the guest quarters, Elena rounded a corner and found herself face to face with Serafina, who was walking alone through the corridor, her golden hair loose around her shoulders. There was no one else nearby, and Elena felt a flicker of nervousness at the sudden encounter, quickly bowing her head in respect. "My lady," she murmured, stepping to the side to let Serafina pass. But Serafina did not move. Instead, she studied Elena for a long, uncomfortable moment, her expression unreadable. "You're the seamstress," she said finally. "Elena, was it?" "Yes, my lady." "I've noticed something interesting since arriving here," Serafina continued, her voice smooth and pleasant, though there was something sharp hidden beneath the surface. "The king seems distracted. More than I would expect from someone preparing to discuss an important alliance. I find myself wondering what, or who, might be responsible for that distraction." Elena's heart pounded, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I wouldn't know anything about that, my lady." "Wouldn't you?" Serafina's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Elena's face, as though searching for cracks in her composure. "I have very good instincts, Elena. They rarely fail me. And right now, they are telling me that you know exactly what I'm talking about." "With respect, my lady," Elena said carefully, choosing her words with great caution. "I am nothing more than a seamstress. I mend clothes and stay out of matters that don't concern me. Whatever distracts the king is not something I would have any influence over." Serafina studied her for another long moment, and Elena forced herself to hold the woman's gaze, refusing to look away first, despite the fear tightening in her chest. Finally, Serafina's lips curved into a thin smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "Perhaps you're right," she said. "Or perhaps you're simply very good at hiding things. Either way, I would advise you to remember your place, Elena. Kings marry for duty, not distraction. Whatever fleeting attention you may have received means nothing in the face of what truly matters. I would hate to see you hurt by believing otherwise." Without waiting for a response, Serafina swept past her, disappearing down the corridor with the same practiced grace she carried everywhere. Elena remained frozen in place for several long moments after she had gone, her heart pounding, her hands trembling around the basket she still carried. She understood the warning for exactly what it was. Serafina knew, or at least suspected enough to feel threatened, and threatened women, Elena knew from experience, often found ways to eliminate whatever stood in their path. She hurried the rest of the way to the guest quarters, delivered the basket without incident, and spent the walk back to her cabin, trying to steady her racing thoughts. That evening, an unexpected knock came at her cabin door. Elena opened it cautiously, and her breath caught when she found Kellen standing outside, his expression tense, his eyes scanning the darkness behind him, as though checking for anyone who might have followed. "You shouldn't be here," Elena whispered, glancing nervously past him toward the camp beyond. "I know," Kellen admitted, stepping inside quickly once she pulled the door open wider. "I won't stay long. I needed to see you." "Serafina spoke to me today," Elena said, closing the door behind him, her voice low with worry. "She suspects something, Kellen. If she finds out the truth, I don't know what she'll do." Kellen's jaw tightened, frustration evident in the sharp lines of his face. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to put you in danger." "It isn't your fault," Elena said softly, though the words did little to ease the tension between them. "But we need to be careful, more careful than we have been." "I know," he said again, running a hand through his hair in the familiar gesture she had come to recognize. "The council meets tomorrow to discuss the formal terms of the alliance. Once the agreement is signed, there will be no turning back." Elena felt her stomach twist painfully at his words. "Then perhaps it's better that way," she said, forcing the words out even though every part of her rebelled against them. "Perhaps it's better if this ends before it becomes something neither of us can control." "Do you truly believe that?" Kellen asked quietly, stepping closer, his storm-gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made it difficult for her to breathe. I don't know what I believe anymore, Elena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I only know that every path forward seems to lead toward pain, for one of us, or both. Kellen reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Elena did not pull away, though her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it in the quiet cabin. I have spent 6 years ruling with my mind instead of my heart, he said softly, making every decision based on duty and logic, because that is what a king is expected to do. But since the moment I saw you at the gate, I have not been able to silence what my heart wants, no matter how hard I try. Kellen, Elena whispered, though she did not know what she meant to say next, did not know how to voice the tangled mess of hope and fear tightening in her chest. I'm not asking you to promise me anything, he continued, his thumb tracing gently along her cheekbone. I know the danger we're both in. I know what the law says, and I know what the council expects, but I needed you to know the truth, even if nothing can come of it. My wolf chose you, Elena, and so did I. The confession settled over her like warmth spreading through cold hands, and for a moment, Elena allowed herself to simply feel it, without questioning, without fear, without the weight of every obstacle standing between them. She leaned slightly into his touch, and something in Kellen's eyes softened further, relief and longing mixing together in equal measure. But the moment could not last. A sound outside the cabin, footsteps moving through the darkness, startled them both apart. Kellen stepped back quickly, his expression shifting instantly into careful neutrality, while Elena moved toward the window, peering cautiously through the gap in the curtains. It's just a guard on patrol, she said after a moment, relief flooding through her. Kellen exhaled slowly, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully ease. I should go. Staying any longer only increases the risk to you. Be careful, Elena said softly, following him to the door. He paused before leaving, turning back to look at her one final time. Whatever happens tomorrow, in the council meeting, I need you to trust that I will find a way through this. I don't yet know what that path looks like, but I promise you, Elena, I will not simply accept a future that does not include you in it. Then he was gone, slipping into the darkness with practiced silence, leaving Elena standing alone in her small cabin, her heart racing, with a strange mixture of hope and terror. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, or how Kellen intended to navigate a council determined to see him married to Serafina. But his words lingered with her long after he had gone, a fragile promise she desperately wanted to believe. The council meeting the following day stretched on for hours. Elena had no way of knowing what was discussed behind the closed doors of the great hall, and the uncertainty gnawed at her throughout the day, making it nearly impossible to focus on her work. She pricked her finger twice while sewing, distracted thoughts pulling her attention away from the needle in her hands, and finally gave up entirely, setting her work aside to pace nervously around her small cabin instead. When evening finally arrived, rumors began circulating through the camp, whispered from person to person, with the particular energy that accompanied significant news. Elena caught fragments of conversation as she moved through the camp, gathering water, delivering finished garments, straining to piece together what had happened behind those closed doors. They say the king pushed back against the council, one voice murmured near the well, insisted on more time before any formal agreement is signed. Serafina was furious, or so I heard, another voice added, stormed out of the meeting entirely. Elena's heart lifted slightly at the news, though she forced herself to remain cautious. A delay was not a refusal. Kellen had bought time, perhaps, but the council's expectations had not disappeared entirely, and Serafina's suspicions had likely only deepened as a result of whatever had transpired in that meeting. She did not see Kellen again that evening, though she thought of him constantly, wondering what price he had paid to secure even a small delay, wondering how much longer he could hold back a council, determined to see its plans fulfilled. She fell asleep eventually, exhausted from the day's tension, and the dream came to her once more, though this time, it carried a different quality entirely. She stood in the silver forest as always, but the black wolf did not wait at the tree line this time. It stood directly before her, closer than it had ever been, its storm-gray eyes filled with something that looked remarkably like determination. They will try to keep us apart, the voice said, quiet but resolute, but I will not let them succeed. Whatever it costs me, Elena, I will find a way to you. She woke slowly, the words lingering in her mind long after the dream had faded, and for the first time since Serafina's arrival, Elena allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that perhaps their story did not have to end the way everyone around them assumed it would. But hope, she knew from painful experience, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by forces far more powerful than two people determined to defy them, and somewhere in the camp, Serafina was already beginning to piece together a plan of her own, one that would test the fragile bond between Elena and Kellen, in ways neither of them had yet imagined. Serafina had not left the council meeting empty-handed, despite the delay Kellen had managed to secure. She had watched him closely throughout the discussion, noting every hesitation, every carefully worded excuse he offered, whenever the elders pressed for a firm commitment. She was not a foolish woman. She had grown up in a noble household, trained since childhood to read the subtle shifts in a person's expression, the small tells that revealed far more than words ever could. And everything she had observed in that meeting confirmed her earlier suspicions beyond any doubt. The king was in love with someone else, and she intended to find out exactly who. She began quietly, the way she had been taught to handle matters of importance, gathering information through careful, indirect questioning, rather than open confrontation. She spoke with attendants who had traveled with Kellen's party, with servants who worked within the guest quarters, with anyone who might have noticed something unusual in the king's behavior since his arrival at Blackthorn. It was one of Kellen's own guards, a young man named Oliver who had joined the king's service only a year earlier, who finally provided the piece of information Serafina had been searching for. He had not meant to betray any confidence, had simply mentioned, in the course of idle conversation designed to seem harmless, that the king had been seen speaking privately with an Omega girl on more than one occasion, always late in the evening, always away from prying eyes. Serafina thanked him politely, gave no indication of how significant the information was, and retreated to her private quarters to consider her next move carefully. Elena, the seamstress. It made a strange kind of sense now, the way the girl had hesitated during their earlier conversation, the careful neutrality she had maintained even as her eyes betrayed something far more complicated underneath. Serafina was not accustomed to losing. She had been raised with the expectation that she would one day become queen, had spent years preparing for exactly this alliance, understanding its importance, not just for her own ambitions, but for the stability it would bring to both packs. She was not about to allow some low-ranking Omega to unravel years of careful planning, simply because the king's wolf had developed an inconvenient attachment. She began formulating a plan that evening, turning possibilities over in her mind, with the same careful precision she applied to every challenge she faced. She could confront Elena directly, of course, but that risked driving the girl and the king closer together out of shared adversity, the way forbidden things so often became more desirable simply because they were forbidden. No, subtlety would serve her far better than confrontation. Instead, she decided to focus her efforts on the council itself, reinforcing their concerns about delay, emphasizing the importance of finalizing the alliance quickly, before any further complications could arise. If she could push the elders to accelerate their timeline, perhaps Kellen would find himself with no room left to maneuver, no opportunity to indulge whatever fascination he currently harbored for the seamstress. She met with Margaret the following morning, requesting a private audience under the guise of discussing wedding preparations, though her true intentions ran considerably deeper. I understand the king requested additional time before finalizing our agreement, Serafina said carefully, once they were alone in one of the smaller meeting rooms. I confess, I find myself concerned by the delay. Alliances built on hesitation rarely prove as stable as those built on decisive commitment. Margaret studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The king has his reasons for caution. Perhaps you should discuss your concerns with him directly. I intend to, Serafina said smoothly, but I wondered if the council might share my perspective. Surely stability matters as much to the elders as it does to me. Any delay only invites further complications, does it not? Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral, though something in her eyes suggested she understood exactly what Serafina was implying, even without direct confirmation. The council shares your desire for stability, my lady. Rest assured, we have already made our concerns known to His Majesty. Whatever distractions may currently occupy his attention, we intend to see this alliance secured, for the good of both our packs. The exchange told Serafina everything she needed to know. Margaret had already suspected something, had likely already spoken to Kellen about the very concerns Serafina now shared. The council, it seemed, was already an ally in this particular battle, even if none of them had spoken the true nature of the problem aloud. Satisfied with the direction of the conversation, Serafina turned her attention toward a different strategy entirely, one that required patience rather than direct confrontation. If Elena could not be removed through open conflict without risking suspicion, perhaps she could simply be made to understand, clearly and permanently, exactly how much danger she invited by continuing whatever connection existed between herself and the king. That evening, Serafina sent one of her personal attendants to deliver a message to Elena's cabin, requesting her presence for a private conversation the following morning. Elena received the summons with a growing sense of dread, understanding immediately that whatever Serafina intended to discuss would not be pleasant. She barely slept that night, her mind racing through every possible reason for the summons, every potential danger it might represent. When morning finally arrived, she dressed carefully, choosing her plainest dress, hoping to appear as unremarkable and unthreatening as possible, though she doubted such efforts would make any real difference to a woman as perceptive as Serafina. She was led to a private garden at the edge of the guest quarters, where Serafina waited alone, seated on a stone bench beneath a flowering tree, her expression calm and composed. Elena approached cautiously, bowing respectfully, before waiting to be addressed. "Thank you for coming," Serafina said, gesturing toward the bench opposite her own. "Please, sit." Elena hesitated, uncertain if such familiarity was appropriate, but eventually lowered herself onto the offered seat, keeping her posture straight and her expression carefully neutral. "I wanted to speak with you honestly," Serafina began, her voice pleasant, but carrying an undertone of steel that Elena did not miss. "I know about you and the king, Elena. I know what you both believe is happening between you, whatever strange attachment your instincts have convinced you is real." Elena's heart pounded, though she forced herself to remain still, refusing to give away more than Serafina already seemed to know. "My lady, I don't believe—" "Please," Serafina interrupted, holding up a hand. "Let's not waste each other's time with denials. I am not here to punish you, Elena. I am here to explain something you may not fully understand, given your position in this pack." She paused, studying Elena's face carefully before continuing. "Kings do not marry for feeling. They marry for duty, for stability, for the well-being of the people they are sworn to protect. Whatever Kellen's wolf believes it wants, indulging that instinct would come at a terrible cost, not just to him, but to every person who depends on the alliance between our packs remaining strong. War has broken out over far smaller disputes than a broken marriage agreement, Elena. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I never asked for any of this," Elena said quietly, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to remain composed. "I never sought his attention." "Perhaps not," Serafina acknowledged, her tone softening slightly, though her eyes remained sharp and calculating. "But you have it now, regardless of how it began. And that means you carry a responsibility, whether you asked for it or not. If you truly care for him, Elena, if this connection means anything beyond your own selfish desires, you will understand that the kindest thing you can do is step away before this goes any further. Let him fulfill his duty. Let him become the king his people need him to be." The words struck deep, precisely as Serafina had intended, and Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely, refusing to give Serafina the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "I understand," Elena finally whispered, though the words felt like broken glass in her throat. Serafina studied her for a long moment, something almost like sympathy flickering briefly across her expression before it vanished entirely. "I am not your enemy, Elena, whatever you may believe. I simply understand what is at stake here in ways you may not yet fully grasp. I hope, for both your sakes, that you make the wise choice." She rose gracefully, signaling the conversation had ended, and Elena stood as well, bowing once more, before turning to leave the garden. She made it only a short distance before the tears finally broke free, streaming silently down her cheeks, as she hurried back toward the safety of her own small cabin, Serafina's words echoing painfully in her mind with every step she took. For 3 days, Elena avoided every possible chance of crossing paths with Kellen. She altered her routines, taking longer paths around the camp, timing her errands to avoid the hours when he typically trained near the fields. It was not easy. Every part of her longed to see him, to hear his voice, to feel the strange, comforting pull that always settled over her whenever he was near. But Serafina's words had lodged themselves deep in her chest, and Elena could not shake the growing certainty that loving him, even quietly, even from a distance, would only bring him harm. She told herself this was the right choice. A king needed stability. A king needed an alliance that would protect his people from war and hardship, not a fragile, forbidden connection with an Omega who had nothing to offer beyond mended clothes and a quiet heart. She repeated these thoughts to herself constantly, hoping that if she said them enough times, she might eventually believe them completely. But belief did not come easily, especially not in the quiet hours of the night, when sleep pulled her back into the silver forest, and the black wolf waited faithfully at the tree line, its storm-gray eyes searching for her, with an intensity that made her chest ache with longing. Kellen noticed her absence immediately. He had grown accustomed, in the short time since his arrival, to catching glimpses of her throughout the camp, brief moments that had somehow become the brightest parts of his otherwise demanding days. When those glimpses stopped entirely, he felt the loss keenly, a hollow ache settling in his chest that no amount of council meetings or training exercises could fill. He asked after her carefully, cautious not to draw unwanted attention, and learned from one of the kitchen staff that Elena had requested additional sewing work that kept her occupied within her own cabin, rather than moving freely through the camp. It was, he suspected, a deliberate choice, though he could not immediately understand why she would suddenly withdraw after the closeness they had shared just days earlier. He found his answer on the fourth day, when Margaret approached him privately after a council meeting, her expression carrying a satisfaction she did not bother to hide. "I understand. Lady Serafina spoke with the seamstress recently," Margaret said, watching his reaction carefully. "A wise conversation, by all accounts. It seems the girl has finally come to understand her place." Kellen felt something cold settle in his stomach at the words. "What did Serafina say to her?" "I couldn't say for certain," Margaret replied, though her tone suggested she knew more than she was willing to admit. "But whatever it was, it seems to have had the desired effect. Perhaps it's for the best, Your Majesty. This alliance is important, and any distraction that threatens its success serves no one well." Kellen said nothing further, though anger simmered beneath his carefully composed exterior as he walked away from the conversation. He understood immediately what must have happened, understood the kind of pressure Serafina was capable of applying when she believed something threatened her interests, and he understood, with growing certainty, that he could not simply let this stand without speaking to Elena himself. He waited until evening fell, when the camp grew quiet and most of its residents retired to their cabins for the night. Slipping away from his guards under the pretense of needing solitude, he made his way toward the small cabin at the edge of the camp, his heart heavy with worry over what he might find waiting for him there. Elena answered his knock cautiously, and her expression shifted from surprise to something closer to panic when she saw who stood outside her door. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing nervously past him into the darkness. "We need to talk," Kellen said firmly, and though every instinct told her to send him away, to protect them both from further danger, Elena found herself stepping aside to let him in. "Serafina spoke to me," she admitted once the door was closed, unwilling to let him hear the truth from anyone else first. She explained what's at stake. War, Kellen. She said this could lead to war between our packs if the alliance fails. "That's not entirely true," Kellen said, his jaw tight with barely controlled frustration. "Tensions exist, yes, but war is not an inevitable consequence of a broken engagement. Serafina exaggerated the danger to frighten you into stepping away." "Even if she exaggerated," Elena said quietly, "the danger isn't entirely false, is it? Alliances matter. Peace matters. I can't be the reason innocent people suffer, Kellen. I won't be." "And what about what we feel?" Kellen asked, his voice softer now, though no less intense. "Does that count for nothing?" Elena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "It counts for everything, and that's exactly why I have to let you go. I care about you too much to be the reason your kingdom falls into chaos." Kellen stepped closer, gently taking her hands in his own, his thumbs tracing softly across her knuckles. "Elena, listen to me," I have spent every day since the council meeting searching for a way through this, a way that doesn't require choosing between duty and my own heart. I am not ready to give up on that search, and I am certainly not ready to give up on you." "What if there is no way through it?" Elena asked, her voice breaking slightly. "What if some things simply cannot be reconciled, no matter how much we might wish otherwise?" "Then I will find a way to reconcile them anyway," Kellen said fiercely, his storm-gray eyes burning with quiet determination. "I refuse to accept that duty, and love must always exist in opposition to one another. There has to be another path forward, Elena. I simply haven't found it yet." Elena wanted desperately to believe him, wanted to let herself hope the way he seemed to hope, but fear held her back. Fear of what might happen if his search failed. Fear of the pain that would follow if she allowed herself to love him fully, only to lose him regardless. "I need time," she finally said. "Time to think. Time to understand what I'm truly willing to risk." Kellen nodded slowly, though disappointment flickered briefly across his expression before he carefully masked it. "I understand. I won't push you further than you're ready to go. But Elena, please, don't let fear make this decision for you. Whatever choice you make it because it's truly what you want, not because you believe it protects me from a danger that may not even be as certain as Serafina claims." He left shortly after, disappearing once more into the darkness, leaving Elena alone, with her tangled thoughts and an ache that refused to fade, no matter how firmly she told herself she was making the right choice. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it finally did, the dream returned, though this time, it carried a heaviness she had not felt before. She stood in the silver forest, but instead of the familiar tree line, she found herself surrounded by a thick, choking mist that obscured everything beyond a few feet in any direction. She called out, searching desperately for the black wolf, for the comforting presence that had always guided her through the darkness. But this time, no howl answered her call. No warm eyes appeared through the mist. She stood alone, surrounded by silence, a cold, creeping fear settling over her as she realized with dawning horror that perhaps she had already made her choice, and perhaps that choice had cost her something she could never get back. She woke, gasping, tears streaming down her face, before she even fully understood why, the lingering emptiness of the dream, refusing to loosen its grip, even as morning light began filtering through her window. Something about the silence, the absence of the voice that had called her name so faithfully every night since Kellen's arrival, terrified her, in a way she could not fully articulate. She spent the following days lost in quiet turmoil, torn between the fear Serafina had planted so carefully in her mind, and the aching hope that Kellen's words had reawakened, despite her best efforts to suppress it. She watched the camp prepare for an upcoming gathering, a formal dinner meant to celebrate the progress of the alliance discussions, and felt her dread growing with each passing hour, understanding instinctively that whatever happened at that dinner would push events toward a resolution neither she nor Kellen could control much longer. The morning of the dinner arrived, with a strange stillness hanging over the camp, as though everyone sensed the significance of what the evening might bring. Elena spent the day helping prepare linens and decorations for the great hall, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind remained elsewhere, circling endlessly around the conversation she had shared with Kellen, and the fragile hope his words had planted despite her every effort to remain guarded. She was not required to attend the dinner itself, of course. Omegas served rather than dined at such formal gatherings, and Elena expected to spend the evening much as she had spent the previous celebration, moving quietly between tables with trays of food and drink, doing her best to remain unnoticed among the noble guests. It was, in some ways, a small relief. She did not think she could bear sitting through an entire meal, watching Kellen and Serafina seated together, performing the roles expected of them. As evening approached, the great hall transformed into something grand and glowing, lanterns strung along the wooden beams overhead, long tables draped in fine cloth, and laden with the finest food the pack could offer. Elena dressed in her simple serving attire, tying her hair back neatly, and made her way toward the kitchens to receive her assignments for the evening. The hall filled quickly once the celebration began, warriors and nobles from both Blackthorn and Ashwood mingling together beneath the warm lantern light. Elena moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, refilling cups and clearing empty plates, careful to keep her eyes lowered whenever she passed near the head table, where Kellen sat beside Serafina, the elders arranged around them in careful formation. She could feel his eyes on her more than once throughout the evening, brief glances stolen whenever Serafina's attention was occupied elsewhere, and each time, Elena forced herself to look away, reminding herself of the promise she had made, however reluctantly, to consider what truly protecting him might require. Midway through the meal, one of the Ashwood elders rose to offer a formal toast, praising the strength of the coming alliance and the peace it would secure for generations. The hall erupted in polite applause, and Elena watched from the edge of the room as Serafina smiled graciously, accepting the well wishes with practiced elegance, her hand resting lightly against Kellen's arm, in a gesture clearly meant to reinforce the image of a devoted couple. Kellen's expression remained composed, though Elena, who had come to know his features perhaps better than she should have, could see the tension hidden beneath his carefully neutral mask. He accepted the toast with appropriate grace, but his eyes, when they briefly found hers across the crowded hall, carried an unmistakable weight of frustration and longing that made her chest tighten painfully. As the evening wore on, Elena found herself assigned to deliver a fresh round of wine to the head table, and her heart pounded as she approached, careful to keep her expression neutral despite the nervous energy coursing through her. She poured Kellen's cup first, her hands steady despite the way her pulse raced, and as she moved to step away, his fingers brushed briefly against hers, so quick and so subtle that anyone watching might have believed it accidental. But Elena felt the deliberate warmth in that brief touch, felt the silent message he seemed to be sending her, even in the midst of a crowded hall filled with watchful eyes. She did not dare look at him directly, aware of Serafina's sharp gaze only a few feet away, but the touch lingered on her skin long after she had moved on to serve the next table, a small, dangerous comfort in the middle of an evening, otherwise filled with careful performance and hidden tension. Serafina, however, missed nothing. She had been watching Elena all evening, tracking her movements through the hall with the same careful attention she applied to everything else, and the brief exchange at the head table did not escape her notice. Her expression did not change, her smile remaining perfectly composed as she continued speaking with the elder beside her. But inwardly, something cold and calculating settled into place. She had given Elena a clear warning, had explained precisely what was at stake, and what sacrifice would be required to protect it. And yet here was proof, small but undeniable, that the girl had not fully heeded that warning. Serafina understood, watching the quiet, charged energy pass between Kellen and the seamstress, even from across a crowded room. That gentle persuasion alone would not be enough to end whatever connection stubbornly persisted between them. She would need to take more decisive action, and soon, before the fragile bond between Kellen and Elena grew strong enough to threaten everything she had worked so carefully to secure. The dinner continued late into the night, filled with music and dancing, and the easy laughter of nobles enjoying a celebration free of immediate concern. Elena worked tirelessly throughout, grateful for the exhausting pace that left little room for her mind to wander too far into dangerous territory. By the time the celebration finally began winding down, her feet ached, and her eyes felt heavy with exhaustion, though sleep, she suspected, would not come easily once she finally returned to her cabin. As she gathered empty trays near the edge of the hall, preparing to carry them back toward the kitchens, she caught sight of Serafina watching her from across the room, an expression on her face that sent a fresh chill through Elena's chest. It was not anger exactly, nor was it the calm, measured warning she had offered during their private conversation days earlier. It was something colder, more calculating, the expression of someone who had finally decided on a course of action and intended to see it through, without further hesitation. Elena forced herself to look away, hurrying toward the kitchens with her arms full of dishes, though the unsettled feeling in her stomach refused to fade. She did not know what Serafina intended, but she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that whatever came next would not be gentle, and it would not be easily undone. 2 days after the dinner, the council announced its decision. Elena heard the news the same way she heard most important events within the camp, through the rapid spread of whispers that moved from cabin to cabin, faster than any official messenger could travel. The formal betrothal between King Kellen and Lady Serafina had been confirmed, the ceremony to take place within the month, the wedding itself planned for the following season. The announcement spread through Blackthorn like wildfire, met with celebration from most corners of the pack, relief from the elders who had pushed so hard for the match, and a quiet, private grief from the one person who had no right to grieve at all. Elena heard the news while helping in the kitchens, and though she forced herself to continue working, to keep her hands moving through familiar tasks, something inside her chest cracked quietly, a hope she had barely allowed herself to hold finally slipping away entirely. She told herself this was inevitable. She had known from the very beginning that whatever existed between herself and Kellen could never survive against the weight of duty and expectation pressing down upon them both. She had told him as much, had asked for time to consider what protecting him truly required, and now, it seemed, the decision had been made for both of them regardless of what either of them wanted. She did not seek him out. She told herself there was no purpose in it now, that seeking comfort from him would only deepen a wound that needed to heal, not fester further. Instead, she threw herself into her work, with a kind of desperate focus, mending clothes until her fingers ached, helping in the kitchens long after her assigned hours ended, anything to keep her mind too occupied to dwell on the announcement that had settled over the camp like a heavy fog. Kellen, for his part, felt the weight of the announcement differently, though no less painfully. He had fought against the council's timeline for as long as he reasonably could, had delayed and deflected, and searched desperately for some alternative path forward that did not require sacrificing everything his wolf so fiercely wanted. But in the end, the pressure had proven too great. The elders unified in their insistence that further delay only invited instability, and Kellen had found himself with no remaining ground to stand upon. He had not agreed easily. The council meeting where the final decision was made had stretched for hours, filled with arguments Kellen had raised again and again, searching for any justification that might buy him more time. But Margaret and the other elders had remained firm, reminding him repeatedly of his duty, of the peace this alliance would secure, of the responsibility he carried not just for himself, but for every person within his kingdom, who depended on his wisdom, rather than his personal desires. In the end, exhausted and outmaneuvered, Kellen had given his consent, though every word of agreement felt like a betrayal of the one thing he had never expected to want so desperately. His wolf had raged against the decision, from the moment the words left his mouth, a fury unlike anything Kellen had experienced before, a restless, desperate need to undo what had just been done. He found himself unable to sleep that night, pacing the length of his quarters while his wolf clawed at the edges of his control, demanding release, demanding action, demanding that he go to her immediately and explain, somehow, some way, that this was not the ending either of them deserved. He did not go to her that night. He told himself it was wisdom that held him back, an understanding that anything he said now would only cause her more pain, that the kindest thing he could offer her was distance, while he figured out what, if anything, remained possible between them. But deep down, beneath the careful justifications, Kellen understood the truth was simpler and far more difficult to accept. He did not know what to say to her, did not know how to explain a decision that felt like tearing his own heart from his chest. And so he said nothing at all, allowing the silence to stretch between them, even as it deepened the wound they both carried. Serafina, meanwhile, felt only satisfaction at the news, though even her satisfaction carried an edge of caution she could not fully shake. She had achieved exactly what she set out to achieve, had secured the formal commitment that would bind Kellen to her, regardless of whatever lingering feelings he harbored toward the seamstress. But she had not missed the way his expression had remained distant throughout the announcement, the careful, practiced smile that never quite reached his storm-gray eyes. She understood, with the same sharp instincts that had served her well throughout her life, that a formal betrothal alone would not be enough to fully secure her position. Feelings, once awakened, did not simply disappear because a council had made a decision. She had seen enough political marriages within her own family to understand that unresolved attachments had a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient moments, threatening carefully built stability, just when it seemed most secure. She decided, in the days following the announcement, that she needed more information, more certainty, about exactly how deep the connection between Kellen and Elena truly ran. If it was merely a passing infatuation, born from his wolf's initial reaction and nothing more, then time and distance would likely be enough to see it fade naturally. But if it was something deeper, something that might resurface even after the wedding had taken place, she needed to understand that threat fully before it had the chance to unravel everything she had worked to secure. She began paying closer attention to the movements within the camp, noting who spent time where, who might have witnessed private moments between the king and the seamstress that had not yet come to her attention. It was through this careful observation that she eventually crossed paths with a young guard named Oliver, the same man who had unknowingly provided her earlier information about Kellen's private conversations with Elena. Oliver was young, eager to prove himself within the king's service, and not particularly skilled at recognizing when his casual comments might carry far greater significance than he intended. Serafina cultivated a friendly rapport with him over several days, careful never to reveal her true purpose, simply engaging him in conversation whenever their paths crossed, gradually building the kind of trust that made careless honesty far more likely. It was during one such conversation, held in the quiet hours of early evening near the training grounds, that Oliver mentioned, almost in passing, that he had seen the king leaving his quarters late at night, on several occasions, always heading in the direction of the smaller cabins at the camp's edge, always returning only shortly before dawn. Serafina kept her expression carefully neutral as she absorbed this information, though inwardly, something cold and certain settled into place. She thanked Oliver for his company, made polite conversation for a few minutes longer, to avoid arousing suspicion, and then excused herself, her mind already turning toward the question of what to do with this newly confirmed knowledge. She did not act immediately. Rushing toward confrontation, she understood, often produced messier results than careful, patient planning. Instead, she spent the following days observing more closely, watching for any additional opportunity that might present itself, any moment where she could gather undeniable proof, rather than relying solely on the second-hand accounts of a young, unsuspecting guard. Her patience was rewarded 4 days later. She had taken to walking the edges of the camp in the evening hours, ostensibly for exercise and fresh air, though her true purpose remained far more calculated. On this particular night, she noticed a familiar figure slipping quietly away from the guest quarters, moving with practiced care through the shadows, toward the smaller cabins beyond. She recognized Kellen immediately, despite the darkness, the shape of his shoulders, and the confidence of his stride, unmistakable, even from a distance. She followed at a careful distance, staying well hidden among the trees that bordered the camp, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and grim satisfaction as she watched him approach a small, familiar cabin and knock softly at the door. It opened almost immediately, as though the person inside had been expecting him, and Serafina caught a brief glimpse of Elena's face, illuminated by the soft candlelight spilling from within, before Kellen slipped inside and the door closed once more. She remained hidden among the trees for nearly an hour, watching the small cabin, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just witnessed. The betrothal had been formally announced. The wedding date had been set. And still, despite everything, despite the promises made before the entire council, Kellen continued sneaking away in the darkness to visit an Omega girl who held no claim over him whatsoever. Serafina felt something sharp and bitter twist in her chest, an emotion she did not fully welcome, but could not entirely deny. She had entered this alliance with clear eyes, understanding it as a political arrangement rather than a matter of the heart, but witnessing the evidence of Kellen's continued devotion to someone else, even now, even after everything, struck a deeper wound than she had expected it to. She waited until Kellen finally emerged from the cabin, moving quickly and quietly back toward the guest quarters, before she allowed herself to retreat as well, her mind already turning toward the question of what to do with the knowledge she now possessed beyond any doubt. She considered confronting Kellen directly, demanding an explanation, perhaps even threatening to end the betrothal herself in retaliation for his continued betrayal. But such a confrontation carried its own risks, she understood. Ending the alliance now, after so much had already been invested in securing it, would create exactly the kind of instability both packs had worked so hard to avoid. It would also, she suspected, simply free Kellen to pursue Elena openly, an outcome Serafina found she was not willing to accept, regardless of her own complicated feelings about the marriage itself. No, she decided finally, as she made her way back toward her own quarters beneath the cold light of the moon. A direct confrontation would accomplish nothing beyond satisfying her own wounded pride. If she truly wanted to end this threat to her position, she needed a solution that removed the obstacle entirely, one that ensured Elena could never again pose a risk to the stability Serafina had worked so carefully to secure. She spent the rest of the night awake, turning over possibilities in her mind, until finally, As the first hints of dawn began creeping over the horizon, a plan began to take shape, one that would require the involvement of the council elders, particularly Margaret, who had already demonstrated a clear commitment to seeing this alliance succeed, regardless of what personal sacrifices it required. By morning, Serafina had made her decision. She would bring her evidence directly to the council, would expose the truth of Kellen's continued relationship with Elena, in front of witnesses whose authority even the king himself could not easily dismiss. It was a risk, certainly, exposing herself to potential embarrassment if the council reacted unpredictably. But Serafina had never been one to shy away from calculated risk when the stakes demanded decisive action. She requested an urgent meeting with Margaret that very morning, her expression composed, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface. Whatever happened next, she understood, would irreversibly alter the fragile balance that had existed within Blackthorn since the moment Kellen Rourke first rode through its gates, and she intended to ensure that when the dust finally settled, her own position remained secure, regardless of what cost that security demanded from anyone else. Margaret received Serafina in one of the smaller council chambers, a modest room, lined with old wooden shelves, holding generations of Blackthorn's recorded history. She listened with careful attention as Serafina laid out what she had witnessed the previous night, her expression growing increasingly grave with each detail Serafina provided. "You are certain of what you saw?" Margaret asked, once Serafina had finished, her sharp eyes studying the younger woman's face for any sign of exaggeration or misunderstanding. "Absolutely certain," Serafina confirmed. "I watched him enter her cabin myself, and I watched him leave nearly an hour later." "This was not a chance encounter, Margaret. This has clearly been happening for some time, likely since the very week he first arrived at Blackthorn." Margaret rose from her seat and moved toward the small window overlooking the training grounds, her expression thoughtful and troubled. She had suspected something of this nature for weeks, had noticed the king's distraction, had heard the whispered rumors that circulated through the camp regardless of how carefully Kellen and Elena had attempted to keep their connection hidden. But suspicion and confirmed evidence were two very different matters, and hearing Serafina's account laid bare in such certain terms troubled her more deeply than she had anticipated. "This is a serious matter," Margaret finally said, turning back to face Serafina. "The law regarding an Alpha King's mate exists for good reason. It protects the stability of alliances, ensures that personal feeling does not undermine decisions that affect the safety and prosperity of entire packs. If the king is found to be violating that law, even before the wedding itself has taken place, the consequences could be severe, both for him and for the girl involved." "What kind of consequences?" Serafina asked, though something in her tone suggested she already understood the answer, even if she required Margaret to confirm it aloud. "Exile, most likely, for the Omega," Margaret said grimly. "The council would have little choice but to remove her from the pack entirely, to ensure no further temptation exists to threaten the alliance. As for the king himself, the consequences would be more complicated, given his position. But the council would certainly demand a formal renewal of his commitment to you, along with assurances that no further contact would occur." Serafina absorbed this information carefully, feeling a complicated mixture of satisfaction and unease settle within her chest. She had come seeking exactly this kind of decisive action, understanding that only the full weight of the council's authority could truly end whatever connection persisted between Kellen and Elena. And yet, hearing the specific consequence laid out so plainly, exile for a girl who had never actively sought any of this attention in the first place, stirred something uncomfortable within her that she had not fully anticipated. "I do not wish to see anyone unfairly punished," Serafina said carefully, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized the complicated truth beneath them. She did not wish to see Elena punished for its own sake, certainly, but neither was she willing to simply step aside and allow the girl to remain a persistent threat to her own future and position. "Fairness is not always possible in matters of this importance," Margaret replied, her tone matter-of-fact rather than unkind. "The stability of two entire packs rests upon this alliance succeeding. Whatever sympathy we might feel for the girl's circumstances cannot be allowed to outweigh that responsibility." Margaret promised to bring the matter before the full council that very evening, understanding the urgency the situation demanded. Serafina left the meeting with her purpose accomplished, though she found herself troubled by a lingering unease she had not expected to carry, a small, persistent voice, reminding her that whatever satisfaction she might feel at securing her position would likely come paired with guilt she had not fully anticipated. Word of the impending council meeting reached Elena far sooner than either Margaret or Serafina intended. One of the kitchen staff, a kind older woman named Grace, who had grown fond of Elena over the years they had worked together, overheard fragments of conversation among the council attendants, preparing the meeting chamber for an urgent evening session. She did not know the full details, only that something serious, involving the king and an unnamed Omega girl, would be discussed, but the fragments she gathered were enough to send a chill of recognition through her when she considered how closely they seemed to align with rumors she had already heard whispered throughout the camp. She found Elena in the sewing room that afternoon, working diligently on a pile of mending that had grown steadily larger over the past week, and pulled her aside with quiet urgency. "Elena, I need to tell you something," Grace said, her voice low despite the empty room around them. "The council is meeting tonight, urgently, to discuss a matter involving the king. I don't know all the details, but I overheard enough to worry that it might concern you." Elena felt the blood drain from her face, her hands going still against the fabric she had been working. "What did you hear exactly?" "Only fragments," Grace admitted, "but enough to suggest that someone has brought evidence forward, evidence of a private relationship between the king and an Omega girl. Elena, please tell me this doesn't concern you." Elena did not answer immediately, her mind racing through the implications of what Grace had just revealed. Serafina must have discovered something, must have found proof of the visits Kellen had continued making despite the danger, and now, it seemed, that proof had made its way to the council itself. "I need to warn him," Elena said quietly, more to herself than to Grace, already moving toward the door. "Elena, wait," Grace called after her, concern evident in her voice. "If the council is already meeting, warning him now may only make things worse. If you're seen together, if anyone suspects you're trying to coordinate a response, it could confirm exactly what they're already investigating." Elena stopped, forcing herself to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her chest. Grace was right, she realized reluctantly. Rushing to find Kellen now, drawing further attention to their connection, at the exact moment the council was preparing to scrutinize it, would only make everything worse. But the thought of remaining passive, of simply waiting to learn her fate, while decisions were made about her future, in a room she had no access to, felt unbearable. "What should I do?" Elena asked, her voice small and uncertain in a way that broke Grace's heart to hear. "Stay calm," Grace said gently, placing a comforting hand on Elena's shoulder. "Stay in your cabin tonight. Don't draw attention to yourself. Whatever happens in that meeting, panicking now will only make things harder to navigate afterward." Elena nodded slowly, though every instinct within her screamed to do something, anything, rather than simply wait helplessly for a verdict that would determine the entire course of her future. She returned to her cabin as evening fell, her hands trembling too badly to continue any meaningful work, her mind replaying every stolen moment she had shared with Kellen, every whispered confession, every dream that had drawn them together despite every reason they had to stay apart. She sat by her small window as darkness settled over the camp, watching the distant lights of the council chamber glowing steadily against the night sky, knowing that somewhere within those walls, her fate and Kellen's were being decided by people who had never once asked either of them what they truly wanted. The waiting stretched on for what felt like hours, each passing minute deepening the knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach, until finally, near midnight, she saw figures emerging from the council chamber, moving with purposeful haste in a direction that made her blood run cold. They were coming toward the cabins, toward her. Elena rose quickly from her seat by the window, her heart pounding so violently she could feel it in her throat. She had no time to prepare, no time to gather her thoughts into anything resembling composure, before a firm knock sounded at her door. She opened it with trembling hands, to find Margaret standing outside, flanked by 2 council guards, her expression stern and unyielding in the flickering torchlight. "Elena," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of formal authority, rather than any personal warmth. "The council requires your presence immediately." "May I ask what this concerns?" Elena asked, though she already understood the answer, even as she forced the question past the tightness in her throat. "You know very well what this concerns," Margaret replied evenly. "Please come with us. It would be wise not to make this more difficult than it already is." Elena had no real choice but to comply. She followed the guards through the dark camp, her legs unsteady beneath her, the cold night air doing nothing to calm the frantic racing of her heart. Whispers followed her passage, a few curious faces peering from cabin windows as she walked past, drawn by the unusual sight of an Omega being escorted through camp so late at night by armed guards. They led her not to the main council chamber, but to a smaller side room, sparsely furnished with a single table and several chairs, clearly meant for private discussions rather than formal proceedings. Elena's stomach twisted further when she saw Kellen already seated at the table, his expression tight with barely controlled anger, his eyes flashing with relief and worry the moment they landed on her. "Elena," he said, half rising from his chair, though Margaret's sharp glance kept him firmly in place. "Please sit," Margaret instructed Elena, gesturing toward the empty chair across from Kellen. Elena obeyed, lowering herself carefully into the seat, acutely aware of the two additional council elders seated along the far wall, watching the proceedings with grim, unreadable expressions. "I will not waste time with unnecessary formality," Margaret began, once everyone had settled. "Evidence has been brought before the council confirming that the king has been engaging in a private, ongoing relationship with this Omega, in direct violation of the laws governing an Alpha King's choice of mate. Given the recent formal betrothal between His Majesty and Lady Seraphina, this violation carries particularly severe implications for the stability of our alliance with Ashwood." "This is not Elena's fault," Kellen said immediately, his voice sharp with barely restrained frustration. "Whatever choices were made, whatever risks were taken, the responsibility rests with me, not with her. The law does not distinguish between fault in matters such as this," one of the other elders spoke up, an older man Elena did not recognize by name. "Both parties bear responsibility for a violation of this magnitude, regardless of differences in rank or authority." "Then punish me," Kellen said fiercely. "Not her. She has done nothing beyond responding to feelings neither of us chose or fully understood." "Your Majesty," Margaret said, her tone softening only slightly, "the council understands the difficulty of your position. Bonds of this nature are not easily controlled, even by those with the strongest wills. But understanding does not change the necessity of addressing this situation decisively. The alliance with Ashwood cannot be allowed to fracture over a matter that, however deeply felt, ultimately threatens the well-being of thousands who depend on the peace this marriage will secure." Elena sat frozen throughout the exchange, her hands clenched tightly in her lap beneath the table, watching helplessly as her fate was debated, as though she were not even present in the room. Finally, unable to remain silent any longer, she spoke, her voice trembling but steady enough to be heard clearly. "What is it you intend to do with me?" The room fell silent for a moment, all eyes turning toward her. Margaret studied her carefully before answering, her expression carrying something that might have been reluctant sympathy, though it did nothing to soften the weight of her words. "The council has decided that you must leave Blackthorn, Elena, immediately and permanently. Your continued presence here poses too great a risk to the stability of the alliance, regardless of your own intentions or feelings in this matter." "No," Kellen said sharply, rising fully from his chair this time, ignoring Margaret's attempt to silence him. "I will not allow this." "Your Majesty," Margaret said firmly, "this is not a matter open for negotiation. The council has made its decision. If you attempt to interfere, you risk far greater consequences, not just for yourself, but for the girl you claim to wish to protect. Defying the council openly would only invite further scrutiny, further danger for her." Kellen's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, torn between the desperate urge to fight against a decision that felt like tearing his own heart from his chest, and the painful understanding that Margaret's warning carried real weight. Any reckless defiance on his part now could easily make Elena's situation far worse rather than better. Elena watched the internal battle playing out across his features, and something inside her, some quiet, aching strength she had not known she possessed, rose to meet the moment. She could not bear to watch him destroy himself trying to protect her, could not bear to be the reason his kingdom fell into the very chaos everyone feared. "I'll go," she said quietly, the words falling into the tense silence of the room like stones into still water. "Elena, no," Kellen said, turning toward her, his eyes filled with desperate protest. "It's all right," she said, though her voice trembled with the effort of keeping herself composed. I understand what's at stake, Kellen. I understood it from the very beginning, even when I let myself hope otherwise. This is the only way to protect everyone, including you. I don't accept that, Kellen said fiercely, though his voice carried an undercurrent of anguish that told her he understood, even as he protested, the impossible corner they had both been backed into. Margaret allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room before speaking again, her tone gentler now, though no less firm. The council will arrange for Elena's safe departure by morning. She will be escorted to a neighboring territory, provided with sufficient resources to establish herself elsewhere. This is not meant as punishment for its own sake, but as a necessary measure to protect the stability both packs depend upon. Elena nodded slowly, though her chest felt hollow, as though something vital had already been carved out of her before she had even left the room. She rose from her chair on unsteady legs, and one of the council guards moved to escort her back toward her cabin to gather what few belongings she owned. Before she could take more than a few steps, Kellen crossed the room quickly, ignoring Margaret's sharp protest, and pulled Elena into a fierce embrace, holding her tightly, as though he could somehow prevent the world from tearing them apart through sheer force of will alone. "This is not over," he whispered against her hair, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. "I don't care what the council decides tonight. I will find a way to make this right, Elena. I promise you that." "Please, don't do anything reckless," Elena whispered back, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. "Promise me, you'll protect your kingdom first. Promise me, you won't let this destroy everything you've worked to build." Kellen did not answer directly, unwilling to make a promise he was not certain he could keep. And after a moment, the council guard gently but firmly separated them, escorting Elena from the room, while Kellen remained behind, his fists clenched, his wolf howling in furious protest beneath the surface of his carefully maintained composure. The walk back to her cabin passed in a blur, Elena barely aware of her surroundings, as grief and shock settled heavily over her. She packed what little she owned with numb, mechanical movements, folding her simple dresses into a worn bag, tucking away the few personal items that held any meaning to her at all. By the time she finished, the first gray light of dawn had begun creeping over the horizon, and she understood, with a heavy, sinking certainty, that her time at Blackthorn, the only home she had ever truly known, was coming to an end. She did not know what waited for her beyond the borders of the only pack she had ever belonged to. She did not know if she would ever see Kellen again, or if the promise he had whispered against her hair in that tense council chamber held any real hope of fulfillment. But as the guards arrived to escort her toward the edge of camp, Elena straightened her shoulders and forced herself to walk forward with whatever quiet dignity she could manage, refusing to let her final moments within these walls be defined entirely by grief. The camp was mostly quiet as she made her way toward the main gate, most of its residents still asleep in the early hours before sunrise. Only a handful of guards moved about, along with a few kitchen workers already beginning their morning preparations. Grace found her along the path, having heard the news through the same network of whispers that carried every significant event through the camp, and pulled Elena into a brief, tearful embrace. "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You didn't deserve any of this. None of us get to choose what we deserve," Elena replied softly, managing a small, sad smile, despite the ache in her chest. "Thank you for everything, Grace. For your kindness, all these years." She continued toward the gate, her escort waiting patiently a short distance away, and it was there, at the very edge of the camp she had called home for as long as she could remember, that she saw him one final time. Kellen stood near the gate, having clearly slipped away from whatever obligations awaited him that morning, his expression carrying a raw, unguarded grief that made Elena's own composure nearly shatter completely. He did not approach her directly, understanding the guards watching them both would report any further contact, but his eyes held hers across the short distance separating them, communicating everything words could not safely express in that moment. Elena allowed herself to hold his gaze for as long as she dared, memorizing the details of his face, the storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams since the very first day they met, the quiet strength in his expression, even amid obvious anguish. She wanted to remember him exactly like this, standing tall despite the pain, refusing to fully surrender to the forces determined to keep them apart. "Take care of yourself, Elena," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for her to hear, though careful enough not to draw unwanted attention. "You too," she managed to whisper back, before the guards gently urged her forward, through the gate, and out into the wide, unfamiliar world, beyond the only home she had ever known. She did not look back, though every part of her ached to. She understood, with painful clarity, that looking back now would only make the leaving harder, would only deepen wounds that already felt impossibly raw. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed forward, on the path stretching out ahead of her, and allowed her escort to lead her toward whatever uncertain future awaited beyond Blackthorn's borders. The journey passed in a haze of quiet grief. Her escort, a stern but not unkind guard named Simon, said little as they traveled, seeming to understand instinctively that Elena required silence rather than conversation. They traveled for the better part of 2 days, moving through unfamiliar forests and along winding paths that carried them steadily further from everything Elena had ever known, until finally, they arrived at the edge of a small, quiet settlement nestled at the border between Blackthorn's territory and unclaimed lands beyond. "This is as far as I am instructed to bring you," Simon said, handing her a small pouch of coins along with a modest supply of provisions. "The council wishes you well, Elena, whatever that may be worth to you now." Elena accepted the provisions with a quiet nod of thanks, watching as Simon turned and began the long journey back toward Blackthorn, leaving her alone at the edge of an unfamiliar settlement with nothing but a small bag of belongings and an aching heart to guide her forward. She found lodging that evening at a modest inn near the settlement's center, using a portion of the coins the council had provided to secure a small room for the night. She sat alone by the window as darkness fell, staring out at unfamiliar streets and unfamiliar faces, feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in her entire life, even during the loneliest years of her childhood within Blackthorn's walls. Sleep came slowly, when it finally arrived, and the dream that greeted her carried a heaviness unlike anything she had experienced before. She stood once more in the silver forest, but everything about it felt different now, dimmer somehow, the silver light struggling against an encroaching darkness that seemed to swallow the edges of the trees. She called out, searching for the familiar black wolf, for the warm, storm-gray eyes that had guided her through so many nights before. This time, faintly, through the darkness, she heard a response, a low, mournful howl, carrying across an impossible distance, filled with longing and determination in equal measure. "I will find you," the voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. "Whatever it costs, Elena, I will find you." She woke with tears streaming silently down her face, the ache in her chest no less painful for the small comfort the dream had offered. She did not know if the promise carried any real weight, or if it was simply her own desperate hope manifesting itself in her sleeping mind. But as she lay awake in the unfamiliar darkness of the small inn room, staring at a ceiling that belonged to no home she had ever known, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that perhaps their story had not yet reached its final ending. Back at Blackthorn, Kellen moved through the following days like a man carved from stone, performing every expected duty with mechanical precision, while something vital inside him remained fractured and raw. He attended council meetings, reviewed border reports, greeted Ashwood attendants with practiced courtesy, all while his wolf paced restlessly beneath the surface, refusing to settle, refusing to accept the emptiness that had taken root since Elena's departure. He did not sleep well. Every night, his wolf pulled at the edges of his control, howling silently for the one person who had ever truly quieted its restless nature, and Kellen found himself standing by his window more often than not, staring out into the darkness, in the direction Elena had been sent, wondering if she was safe, wondering if she thought of him at all, amid whatever new struggles she now faced alone. Margaret noticed the change in him, of course. She had known Kellen since he was a young boy training under his father's watchful guidance, had watched him grow into the composed, capable leader he had become, and the hollow, distant quality that now clouded his every expression troubled her more than she cared to admit, even to herself. She found him one evening standing alone at the edge of the training grounds, staring out at nothing in particular, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed far heavier than any single conversation could explain. "Your Majesty," she said gently, approaching carefully. "You've barely eaten today. The staff are concerned." "I'm fine," Kellen said, though the flat, distant quality of his voice suggested otherwise. Margaret studied him for a long moment before speaking again, her tone softer than he had heard from her in quite some time. I understand this has been difficult for you, perhaps more difficult than I initially recognized. Kellen turned to look at her, something sharp flashing briefly in his storm-gray eyes. Do you? Do you truly understand what it means to have your wolf claim someone, only to be forced to send her away, knowing she carries a piece of you that can never simply be returned? Margaret did not answer immediately, choosing her words carefully. I understand duty, Your Majesty. I understand sacrifice for the good of one's people. Whether I fully understand the particular pain you're describing, I cannot say with certainty. But I have watched you these past days, and I confess, the toll this has taken concerns me greatly, both for your well-being and for the strength of leadership your people depend upon. Then perhaps the council should have considered that before demanding I tear my own heart out to satisfy an alliance built on nothing more than political convenience, Kellen said, bitterness sharpening his words more than he intended. The alliance protects thousands of lives, Margaret reminded him gently. That is not nothing, Your Majesty, however painful the personal cost may feel right now. Kellen said nothing further, turning his gaze back toward the darkening horizon, and after a moment, Margaret retreated, leaving him alone with thoughts that offered no easy comfort. She did not know, as she walked away, that her words, meant to offer perspective, had instead settled into Kellen's mind, alongside a growing, dangerous clarity that had been building steadily since the night Elena left. He understood the importance of the alliance. He had never denied it, had spent weeks trying to find some path forward that honored both his duty and his heart, before circumstances forced his hand. But standing there in the fading evening light, feeling the hollow ache that had settled permanently into his chest since Elena's departure, Kellen began to question, more seriously than he ever had before, whether the price the council demanded was truly one he was willing to keep paying indefinitely. His wolf, restless and insistent, seemed to sense the shift in his thinking, growing quieter for the first time in days, as though sensing that its persistent howling had finally begun to break through the careful walls Kellen had built around his own resolve. 3 days later, Serafina found him in the palace gardens, sitting alone on a stone bench beneath the same flowering tree where she had once delivered her careful warning to Elena. She approached slowly, studying his distant expression, feeling a complicated mixture of guilt and frustration stirring within her as she took in the hollow quality that had settled over him since Elena's exile. "May I sit?" she asked, gesturing toward the empty space on the bench beside him. Kellen glanced up, his expression carefully neutral, though weariness lingered clearly beneath the surface. "Of course." Serafina settled beside him, quiet for a long moment, before finally speaking. "I did not expect this to weigh on you so heavily," she admitted, her voice softer than he had heard from her before. "I understood your feelings existed, of course, but I did not fully grasp the depth of them, not until I watched what her absence has done to you these past days." "Does it matter now?" Kellen asked, his tone not unkind, though carrying a weariness that made the question feel more like an honest inquiry than bitter accusation. "Perhaps not," Serafina admitted, "but I find myself troubled regardless. I came to this alliance understanding it as a matter of duty rather than affection, prepared to build a partnership based on mutual respect rather than romantic feeling. I did not anticipate feeling guilt over securing exactly the outcome I sought." Kellen studied her for a long moment, surprised by the honesty in her admission. "Why tell me this now?" Serafina was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the flowering branches overhead. "Because I find myself wondering, Kellen, whether the peace this alliance secures is truly worth the cost, if it comes at the price of watching you become a hollow shell of the leader your people need. A kingdom is not well served by a king who has lost the will to fully live, regardless of how dutifully he performs his obligations." "What are you saying?" Kellen asked carefully. "I am saying," Serafina replied slowly, as though still working through the thought even as she spoke it aloud, "that perhaps I acted too quickly in bringing my evidence before the council. Perhaps there existed other paths forward that I did not fully consider in my haste to secure my own position." Kellen felt something shift within his chest, a cautious, fragile hope beginning to stir for the first time since Elena's departure. "Are you suggesting the council's decision could be reversed?" "I don't know," Serafina admitted honestly. "The council does not easily unmake decisions once formalized. and my own father would likely view any reversal as a personal insult to Ashwood's honor. But I find myself less certain than I once was that forcing this marriage forward, built as it is on your unresolved feelings for someone else, truly serves either of our interests, or the peace we both claim to value so highly. Kellen sat in stunned silence, processing the unexpected shift in Serafina's position. He had expected many things from this conversation, but not this quiet, complicated honesty, not this reluctant acknowledgement that perhaps the path they had all agreed to walk was not as straightforward or as wise as it had initially seemed. "What would you propose instead?" he asked carefully. "I don't have a full answer," Serafina admitted, "but I know that I do not wish to spend the rest of my life bound to a husband who looks at me the way one looks at an obligation rather than a partner. Whatever satisfaction I felt in securing this alliance has faded considerably these past days, watching what it has cost you, and understanding, perhaps for the first time, what it might eventually cost me as well." They sat together in silence for a while longer, the weight of her words settling between them, neither entirely certain what path forward existed beyond the rigid expectations both had been raised to fulfill. Finally, Serafina rose from the bench, offering him a small, thoughtful nod before turning to leave. "I need time to think," she said quietly, "and perhaps, Your Majesty, so do you." Kellen remained in the garden long after she had gone, turning her words over carefully in his mind, feeling something shift within him that had remained frozen since the night Elena walked through Blackthorn's gates for the final time. He did not yet know what path forward existed, did not know if Serafina's unexpected honesty would translate into any real change within the council's rigid position, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel something other than hollow grief, a small, stubborn ember of hope that perhaps, against every obstacle stacked before them, some version of a future with Elena still remained possible. That night, his wolf's restless pacing finally quieted into something calmer, more focused, as though sensing the shift in Kellen's own resolve. He lay awake staring at the ceiling of his quarters, his mind working through every possibility, every risk, every consequence that might follow, if he chose to defy the council's decision entirely, rather than simply hoping for a reversal that might never come. By morning, Kellen had made his decision. He would not simply wait for permission that might never arrive. He would not continue performing the role of a dutiful king while the one person who had ever truly reached his wolf remained exiled, alone and frightened, in unfamiliar territory beyond Blackthorn's protection. Whatever the cost, whatever consequences awaited him, he intended to find Elena, and he intended to bring her home, regardless of what the council or tradition demanded of him instead. He rose before dawn, dressed quickly, and made his way toward the stables, his mind already turning toward the practical details of the journey ahead. He did not know exactly where Elena had been taken, only the general direction Simon's escort had traveled, but he intended to search every settlement, every village, every corner of the surrounding territory, until he found her, no matter how long the search required. As he saddled his horse in the quiet gray light of early morning, his wolf finally settled into calm, purposeful readiness, sensing, perhaps before Kellen himself fully understood it, that everything was about to change. He had nearly finished preparing his horse, when a familiar voice called out from across the stable yard, sharp with alarm. "Your Majesty, where are you going?" Kellen turned to find Margaret standing near the stable entrance, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the morning chill, her expression a mixture of concern and dawning suspicion, as she took in the sight of him fully dressed for travel at such an early hour. "I have business to attend to," Kellen said evenly, tightening the last strap on his saddle. "Business that requires you to leave without informing the council, without even a proper escort," Margaret pressed, stepping closer, her sharp eyes studying his face with the same careful attention she applied to every important matter. "Kellen, I have known you since you were a boy. Do not insult me by pretending this is ordinary business." Kellen met her gaze steadily, understanding that further deception would accomplish nothing beyond delaying an inevitable confrontation. "I am going to find Elena," he said plainly. "I do not intend to leave her exiled and alone while I remain here, performing duties that mean less to me. With every passing day her absence continues." Margaret's expression tightened, though something beneath the sternness suggested she was not entirely surprised by his declaration. "You understand what defying the council so openly will mean. This is not a small act of rebellion, Kellen. This threatens the very foundation of the alliance we have all worked so carefully to secure. I understand the risk, Kellen said. I have considered it carefully, more carefully than you might believe. But I cannot continue living as a hollow version of the man I once was, performing duty, while the part of me that feels most alive remains exiled beyond our borders. If that makes me unfit to rule in the Council's eyes, then perhaps it is time we discover exactly what kind of King Blackthorn truly needs. And Lady Seraphina? Margaret asked. Have you considered what this means for her, for the promises already made? I spoke with Seraphina yesterday, Kellen said quietly. She herself expressed doubts about the wisdom of forcing this marriage forward under these circumstances. I do not believe she will stand in my way, Margaret, whatever the Council ultimately decides. Margaret studied him for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing the full implications of what he intended to do. Finally, she sighed, some of the sternness in her expression softening into something closer to reluctant understanding. You have always possessed a stubborn heart, Kellen, even as a boy. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that maturity and duty might eventually temper that stubbornness. It seems I was mistaken. Perhaps some things are worth remaining stubborn about, Kellen replied, a faint, tired smile touching the corner of his mouth for the first time in days. Margaret shook her head slowly, though whatever disapproval she felt seemed to be losing ground against a quieter, more complicated respect. I cannot approve of this course of action, Your Majesty, but I also understand that stopping you would require force I am not prepared to use against my own king. Go then, if you must, but understand that the Council will not simply overlook this defiance. Whatever you find beyond our borders, you will need a plan for what comes after, if you hope to return with any authority left intact. I intend to earn that authority back through actions, rather than empty promises, Kellen said firmly, swinging up into his saddle. Starting with bringing Elena home, where she belongs. Margaret stepped back, watching as he settled into the saddle and gathered the reins, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of worry and something that might have been, despite everything, a flicker of hope. Safe travels, Your Majesty. I suspect Blackthorn will look very different by the time you return, one way or another. Kellen nodded once in acknowledgement, then turned his horse toward the main gate, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, unlike anything he had experienced in his 6 years as Alpha King. He did not know exactly what challenges awaited him beyond Blackthorn's borders, did not know how difficult the search for Elena might prove, or what obstacles the Council might raise in his absence. But for the first time since the night she had been forced through those very gates, he felt something close to peace, settling over his restless wolf, a quiet certainty that he was finally moving in the right direction, toward the one person capable of making him feel whole again. He rode out as the sun crested fully over the horizon, leaving behind the only home he had ever known, trading the safety of certainty for the uncertain promise of a future he intended to build with his own hands, regardless of what tradition or law demanded otherwise. Behind him, Blackthorn stirred slowly awake to a morning that would, by evening, carry news of the king's sudden and unauthorized departure through every corner of the camp, sparking exactly the kind of uproar Margaret had predicted. But Kellen did not look back. His eyes remained fixed firmly on the road ahead, his wolf steady and resolute beneath his skin, both of them united at last in singular, unwavering purpose. Elena, meanwhile, had spent the days since her arrival at the small border settlement trying to build some semblance of a new life, though every attempt felt hollow and forced, like wearing clothes that did not quite fit. She had found modest work with a local seamstress named Nora, a kind, no-nonsense woman who asked few questions about Elena's past and seemed content simply to have skilled help in her busy shop. The work itself felt familiar, comfortingly so, her hands moving through the same practiced motions she had performed for years at Blackthorn. But everything else about her new circumstances felt foreign and unsettling. She missed the familiar sounds of the pack, the particular quality of morning light filtering through the trees she had known her entire life, the small, quiet comforts of a home she had never fully appreciated until it was taken from her. Most of all, she missed him. She tried not to dwell on thoughts of Kellen too often, understanding that doing so only deepened a wound that desperately needed time to heal. But the dreams continued, regardless of her waking efforts to move forward, the silver forest appearing each night, The promise she had heard whispered through the darkness lingering stubbornly in her mind, no matter how firmly she tried to convince herself it was nothing more than wishful thinking, born from grief. Nora noticed her distraction more than once, though she said little about it directly, offering instead small kindnesses that Elena had not expected from a stranger, an extra portion of stew during meals, patient understanding when Elena's concentration wavered during particularly difficult sewing projects. It was during one such quiet evening, as they sat together mending a large batch of clothing by lamplight, that Nora finally asked the question Elena had been dreading. "You're not from around here, are you?" Nora said, not quite a question, her eyes kind but perceptive as she studied Elena across the small table between them. "No," Elena admitted quietly. "I came from further north." "Trouble follow you here?" Nora asked, her tone carrying no judgment, simply honest curiosity. Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but something about Nora's steady, unassuming kindness made her want to answer honestly, at least in part. "Something like that," she finally said. "I left behind someone I cared for very much. Circumstances made it impossible for us to remain together." Nora nodded slowly, as though this explanation confirmed something she had already suspected. "Circumstances have a way of separating people who shouldn't be separated," she said thoughtfully. "But they also have a way of working themselves out, given enough time and enough determination from the people involved. I don't think this particular circumstance will work itself out," Elena said softly, though even as she spoke the words, some small, stubborn part of her resisted fully believing them. Nora studied her for a long moment, before returning her attention to the mending in her lap. "Well, for what it's worth, dear, I've lived long enough to learn that determined hearts have a funny way of finding paths that seem impossible to everyone else. Don't give up on your circumstance quite so easily, if I were you." Elena did not respond, though Nora's words lingered with her long after their conversation ended, a small, fragile seed of hope she tried desperately not to nurture too carefully, understanding how much it would hurt if that hope ultimately proved misplaced. Days passed slowly in the small settlement, each one blurring into the next with a monotony that Elena found both comforting and quietly unbearable. She threw herself into her work, learned the rhythms of her new surroundings, and gradually began to construct something resembling a routine, though the hollow ache in her chest never fully faded, no matter how busy she kept her hands, or how firmly she tried to redirect her thoughts. It was on the 6th day since her arrival that everything changed. She had just finished delivering a completed order to a customer at the edge of the settlement, and was making her way back toward Nora's shop through the narrow, winding streets, when she noticed an unusual commotion near the settlement's main square. A crowd had gathered, murmuring excitedly among themselves, and curiosity pulled Elena toward the edge of the gathering, despite her general preference for avoiding crowds since her arrival. "They say he's been asking after a young woman," one voice was saying, carrying easily over the low hum of conversation. "Traveled from quite far north, apparently, searching every settlement along the border. A nobleman, judging by his horse and bearing," another voice added, "though he hasn't given his name to anyone." Elena's heart began to pound, a wild, desperate hope flaring to life in her chest before she could stop it, though she immediately tried to reason herself out of the thought. It could be anyone, she told herself. Nobles traveled through border settlements for countless reasons that had nothing to do with her at all. She should not allow herself to hope, should not risk the crushing disappointment that would follow if her assumption proved wrong. But her feet carried her forward regardless, pushing gently through the edge of the crowd, straining to catch a glimpse of whoever had generated such curious interest among the settlement's residents. And when the crowd shifted enough to reveal the figure standing near the settlement's small inn, speaking earnestly with the innkeeper, Elena's breath caught entirely in her throat. Dark hair, broad shoulders carrying an unmistakable, quiet authority despite the plain traveling clothes he wore instead of his usual formal attire. And when he turned, as though some instinct had alerted him to her presence even before he consciously registered it, storm-gray eyes met hers across the crowded square, filled with an intensity that stole whatever breath remained in her lungs. "Elena," Kellen breathed, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden hush that fell over the immediate crowd, as people began to notice the charged, unmistakable connection passing between the traveling nobleman and the young seamstress who had recently taken up residence among them. Elena stood frozen for a long moment, unable to fully process that he was truly standing there, real and solid and undeniably present, after days of dreaming and hoping and trying desperately not to hope at all. Then, before conscious thought could catch up with instinct, she found herself moving forward, closing the distance between them, with quick, unsteady steps, until finally, impossibly, she was standing directly before him. "You came," she whispered, tears already gathering at the corners of her eyes. "I told you I would find you," Kellen said, his voice rough with emotion, his eyes searching her face, as though memorizing every detail he had feared he might never see again. "I meant it, Elena. Every word." "But the council," she said, even as her heart soared with a joy she could not fully contain. "Serafina, the Alliance, everything you're risking." "Later," Kellen said gently, reaching out to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing tenderly across her cheekbones. "We'll discuss all of that later, I promise you. Right now, I simply need you to know that I am done pretending duty, and love cannot exist together. I am done accepting a future that does not include you in it, whatever it costs me to build a different path forward." The crowd around them had grown noticeably curious, whispers spreading rapidly, as onlookers began to piece together the unusual scene playing out before them. A clearly noble traveler, declaring himself so openly to a simple seamstress in the middle of a public square. But Elena found she did not care. Not in this moment. Not with Kellen's hands warm against her face, and his eyes holding hers with such fierce, unwavering devotion. "What happens now?" she asked softly, though hope had already begun to outweigh the fear that had lived so heavily in her chest since the night she left Blackthorn. "Now," Kellen said, a faint, determined smile touching the corner of his mouth, "we go home together, and we face whatever comes next, side by side, exactly as it should have been from the very beginning." Nora appeared at the edge of the crowd a few moments later, having heard the commotion from her shop nearby, and her sharp eyes took in the scene before her, with quick understanding. She approached calmly, offering Kellen a respectful nod despite his plain traveling attire, clearly recognizing the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "I take it this is the circumstance you mentioned," Nora said to Elena, a knowing warmth in her voice. "Something like that," Elena replied, a genuine smile breaking through her tears for the first time in days. "Well then," Nora said, glancing between the two of them with evident approval, "perhaps you'd both like somewhere private to talk, away from all these curious eyes. My shop is just around the corner, and the back room is quiet this time of day." Grateful for the offer, Elena and Kellen followed Nora back to her small shop, leaving the murmuring crowd behind, though whispers of the encounter would undoubtedly spread through the settlement long before evening fell. Once settled in the quiet privacy of Nora's back room, Kellen finally allowed himself to fully explain everything that had happened since Elena's departure. The conversation with Serafina in the garden, Margaret's reluctant acceptance of his decision to leave, the 4 days of searching that had led him from settlement to settlement along the border, until finally, he had found her. "Serafina truly said that?" Elena asked, still struggling to fully process the unexpected shift in the other woman's position. "That she doubted the wisdom of the marriage?" "She did," Kellen confirmed. "I don't fully understand what changed her thinking, though I suspect watching the toll these past weeks took on me played some part in it. Whatever her reasons, I am grateful for the honesty, even if the council ultimately refuses to accept any change to their original decision." "And if they refuse?" Elena asked quietly, old fears resurfacing despite the joy of their reunion. "What happens then, Kellen? I won't be the reason war breaks out between our packs. I meant that when I said it before, and I still mean it now." Kellen took her hands gently in his own, his expression turning serious and thoughtful. "I don't believe war is truly the risk here, Elena, whatever fears Serafina initially used to convince you otherwise. Tensions between packs rarely erupt into open conflict over a single broken betrothal, not when both sides still value the practical benefits of maintaining peace along our shared borders. The greater risk lies in political embarrassment, in wounded pride among the elders who pushed so hard for this particular match." "That still matters," Elena said. "Pride has started wars before." "It has," Kellen acknowledged. "Which is why I don't intend to simply demand acceptance without offering something in return. I've been thinking, during my journey here, about ways to address the council's legitimate concerns, while still choosing the path my heart demands. Ashwood values stability and strong borders, above almost everything else. Perhaps there exist other ways to secure that stability. Alliances built on trade agreements or mutual defense pacts, rather than a marriage neither Serafina nor I truly wanted. Elena listened carefully, feeling a cautious hope building steadily within her chest, as Kellen outlined the beginnings of a plan he had clearly been considering throughout his long journey to find her. It would not be simple, she understood. Convincing an entire council to abandon carefully laid plans, convincing Ashwood's own leadership to accept an alternative arrangement. None of it would happen easily, or without significant negotiation and compromise. But for the first time since the night she had been forced through Blackthorn's gates, Elena allowed herself to believe that perhaps a genuine path forward existed, one that did not require sacrificing either duty or love entirely. "There's something else," Kellen said quietly, once he had finished outlining his tentative plans. "Something I need you to understand fully, Elena, before we take another step forward together." "What is it?" she asked, searching his expression with sudden concern. "My wolf chose you the moment I first saw you at the gate," Kellen said, his voice low and earnest. "I have known this from the very beginning, even when I tried to convince myself otherwise for the sake of duty. But choosing to formally claim you as my mate, publicly, before the pack, carries consequences beyond simply defying the council's wishes regarding Serafina. It means binding my future to yours completely, in a way that cannot easily be undone. I need to know that you want this too, not simply because circumstances have pushed us together, but because you truly choose this path, with full understanding of everything it will require of you." Elena felt the weight of his words settle over her, understanding the seriousness with which he offered this final, crucial question. She thought of everything she had already sacrificed, the home she had lost, the fear she had carried these past days, the uncertain future that still lay ahead of them both. And she thought, too, of the quiet, unshakable pull she had felt toward him from the very first moment their eyes met, across the training ground, a connection that had only deepened with every stolen conversation, every whispered dream, every fierce, protective promise he had made and kept. "I choose you," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. "I have chosen you since the very beginning, Kellen, even when I tried to convince myself I shouldn't. Whatever this path requires, whatever it costs us both, I choose it, and I choose you." Kellen's expression broke into something raw and relieved, and he pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close, as though he never intended to let her go again. Outside, the settlement continued its ordinary evening rhythms, unaware that within Nora's small shop, two people had just quietly committed themselves to a future that would soon test every remaining obstacle standing between them and the life they were determined to build together. They departed for Blackthorn early the following morning, Elena riding beside Kellen on a second horse he had arranged through Nora's local connections, her small bag of belongings secured behind her saddle. Nora had bid them farewell with a warm embrace and a knowing smile, wishing them well with the particular confidence of someone who had seen enough of the world to recognize genuine devotion when it stood before her. The journey back felt entirely different from the lonely, grief-filled passage Elena had traveled just days earlier, where before every mile had carried her further from everything familiar. Now, each step brought her closer to a future she had barely allowed herself to imagine possible. Kellen rode close beside her throughout the journey, and though urgency pressed them to move quickly, he made certain to pause often enough for Elena to rest, understanding the emotional toll of recent days had left her more exhausted than she cared to admit. They spoke at length during the journey, filling in details neither had shared before. Elena describing her difficult days at the settlement, Kellen explaining more fully the political calculations he hoped might smooth their path forward once they returned. It was during one such conversation, as they made camp for the night beneath a canopy of stars not unlike those they had once shared on the step of her cabin, that Elena finally voiced a fear that had been building steadily since their reunion. "What if the council refuses everything?" she asked quietly, staring into the small fire Kellen had built. "What if Ashwood demands the marriage proceed regardless of what either you or Serafina now want?" Kellen considered the question seriously before answering. "Then I will face that reality when it arrives, Elena. But I no longer intend to make decisions from a place of fear alone. Whatever consequences follow from choosing you openly, I would rather face them honestly than continue living a life built on suppressing everything my wolf and my own heart demand." "Even if it costs you the crown?" Elena asked softly. Even then, Kellen said firmly, meeting her eyes across the flickering firelight. Though I don't believe it will come to that, not truly. The council values stability above almost everything else, and open conflict within Blackthorn's own leadership would threaten that stability far more than an alternative arrangement with Ashwood ever could. Margaret understands this, even if her initial instinct was to enforce tradition without question. They reached the outskirts of Blackthorn's territory by midday on the second day of travel, and Elena felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of anticipation and dread as familiar landmarks began appearing along the road, the same forests and hills she had passed through during her exile, now welcoming her back into uncertain territory. Word of their approach had clearly traveled ahead of them, likely carried by travelers who had witnessed their reunion at the border settlement, because a small group of guards waited at the main gate as they finally arrived, their expressions carefully guarded. "Your Majesty," the lead guard said, bowing respectfully, though his eyes carried obvious tension. "The council has been informed of your return. They request your immediate presence, along with that of the young woman accompanying you." "Of course," Kellen said evenly, though Elena could feel the tension radiating from him despite his composed exterior. "Lead the way." They were escorted directly to the main council chamber, a grand room Elena had never actually entered before, despite having lived within Blackthorn's walls for the majority of her life. Long wooden tables stretched across the space, and the full council sat assembled, along with several Ashwood representatives, their expressions ranging from open disapproval to cautious curiosity as Kellen and Elena entered together. Serafina sat among the gathered nobles, and Elena felt a flicker of nervous uncertainty as their eyes met briefly across the room. But rather than the cold calculation Elena had expected, Serafina's expression carried something closer to quiet resolve, a subtle nod passing between them that suggested whatever conversation had occurred between herself and Kellen in the garden had truly shifted her position. Margaret rose as they approached the center of the chamber, her expression stern but not entirely unkind. "Your Majesty, you have returned rather more dramatically than you departed. I trust you have given serious consideration to the consequences of your absence, and of the company you have chosen to bring back with you." "I have considered everything carefully, Margaret," Kellen said, his voice steady and clear enough to carry throughout the entire chamber. "And I stand before this council today to formally request a reconsideration of the terms governing my marriage, and to explain, honestly and completely, why I believe an alternative path forward serves both Blackthorn and Ashwood far better than the arrangement previously agreed upon." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members, several of the Ashwood representatives exchanging sharp, disapproving glances. One older man, whom Elena recognized as Serafina's father, rose from his seat, his expression carrying obvious displeasure. "This is a serious insult to my family's honor," he said, his voice carrying clear authority despite his advancing years. "My daughter was promised a proper marriage, a proper alliance between our packs. Now you return, having openly pursued another woman in direct violation of that agreement, and expect us to simply accept whatever alternative arrangement you propose?" "Father," Serafina said, rising from her own seat, her voice carrying surprising firmness, "if I may speak." The room fell into surprised silence, all eyes turning toward Serafina as she stepped forward, her expression composed despite the weight of every gaze fixed upon her. "I do not believe this marriage would have served either myself or King Kellen well, given the circumstances," she said clearly. "A partnership built upon one party's unresolved feelings for someone else is not a foundation for lasting stability, whatever comfort the formal agreement might initially provide. I have spoken with the king, and I believe an alternative arrangement, one built on mutual benefit rather than forced sentiment, would serve both our packs far more effectively." "You would simply set aside years of careful planning?" her father demanded, clearly stunned by his daughter's unexpected position. "I would set aside a plan that no longer serves its intended purpose," Serafina replied evenly. "Peace and stability remain achievable through other means, father. A trade agreement, perhaps, or a formal defense pact between our packs, arrangements that do not require either myself or King Kellen to sacrifice genuine happiness for the sake of tradition alone." The chamber erupted into hushed, urgent conversation, council members and Ashwood representatives alike, debating the sudden, unexpected shift in circumstances. Margaret allowed the discussion to continue for several minutes before raising her hand for silence, her sharp eyes moving between Kellen, Elena, and Serafina with careful consideration. "This is a significant departure from our previous agreement," Margaret said finally. "The council cannot simply accept such a change without careful deliberation. However," she continued, glancing meaningfully toward the Ashwood representatives, "if both parties directly involved in the original arrangement no longer believe it serves their genuine interests, and if an alternative path exists that maintains the practical benefits of alliance between our packs, the council would be foolish to reject such a proposal outright, simply for the sake of preserving tradition that no longer fits our present circumstances." Serafina's father remained visibly unhappy, but after a long, tense silence, he finally spoke again, his tone considerably more measured than before. "I will require guarantees. A formal trade agreement, strong enough to satisfy Ashwood's economic interests. A mutual defense pact, binding enough to ensure neither pack could be caught vulnerable should conflict arise elsewhere. These are not small concessions I am asking for, Your Majesty. I am prepared to negotiate whatever terms satisfy those requirements," Kellen said immediately, relief evident beneath his carefully maintained composure. "Blackthorn values peace and stability as much as Ashwood does. I have no intention of allowing personal circumstances to weaken the practical bonds between our packs." The negotiations that followed stretched on for the better part of the afternoon, council members and Ashwood representatives working through detailed terms, while Elena stood quietly at the edge of the chamber, watching the careful, complicated process of political compromise unfold before her. She understood, even as relief began settling cautiously into her chest, that the path forward would not simply resolve itself through a single dramatic declaration. Real, lasting peace required patience, careful negotiation, and genuine goodwill from all parties involved. But as the afternoon wore on, and the terms of a new agreement gradually took shape, an agreement built on trade and mutual defense, rather than a forced marriage, neither Kellen nor Serafina had truly wanted, Elena allowed herself to believe, with growing certainty, that perhaps this impossible situation might finally find a resolution that honored everyone's genuine interests, rather than sacrificing happiness for the sake of rigid tradition. By evening, the broad outlines of a new agreement had been reached, satisfying enough to both parties that formal documentation could begin the following day. Serafina's father, though still visibly reluctant, finally extended a formal hand toward Kellen, sealing the preliminary terms with the kind of careful, measured respect that political leaders reserved for agreements built on practical necessity rather than personal warmth. As the council chamber slowly emptied, exhausted representatives retreating toward their respective quarters after the long day of intense negotiation, Kellen finally turned toward Elena, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. "It's not finished yet," he said quietly, once they had stepped outside into the cool evening air. "There remains one more matter the council must address, perhaps the most important matter of all." "What is that?" Elena asked, though something in his expression already suggested she knew what he meant to say. "The question of my mate," Kellen said softly, taking her hands gently in his own. "The council has agreed to set aside the marriage to Serafina. But they have not yet formally addressed what happens next, whether they will accept my choice, or whether further obstacles await us before this journey finally reaches its conclusion." Elena felt the familiar knot of anxiety return to her chest, understanding that despite the significant progress made that day, the final, most personal battle still lay ahead of them. But as she looked up into Kellen's storm-gray eyes, steady and unwavering despite the uncertainty of what remained, she found herself drawing strength from his quiet determination, understanding that whatever challenges still awaited them, they would face them together, exactly as he had promised from the very beginning. "Then let's finish what we started," she said softly, squeezing his hands with quiet resolve. "Whatever the council decides, Kellen, I am not walking away from this again." Kellen's expression softened into something warm and grateful, and he leaned down to press a gentle kiss against her forehead, a small, tender gesture that carried the weight of every promise he had made since the night he first found her again at the border settlement. "Neither am I," he whispered against her hair. "Not this time, not ever again." The following morning, the council reconvened to address the final matter still hanging unresolved between them. Elena stood beside Kellen at the center of the chamber, her heart pounding as Margaret rose to address the gathered elders, her expression carrying the weight of careful deliberation. The council has spent considerable time discussing the matter of the king's chosen mate, Margaret began, her sharp eyes moving across the assembled faces before settling on Elena. The law governing an Alpha King's choice has existed for generations, designed to protect the stability of our kingdom through carefully considered alliances. Yesterday's negotiations with Ashwood have addressed the practical concerns that originally motivated the king's betrothal to Lady Seraphina. However, the question remains whether the council will formally recognize a mate chosen through instinct and personal feeling rather than political calculation. An older elder Elena did not recognize. A stern man with graying hair and sharp, disapproving eyes rose from his seat before Margaret could continue further. With respect, Margaret, this sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow the king to choose his mate based purely on personal attraction, disregarding lineage and rank entirely, what does that say to future generations about the importance of careful, considered leadership? Tradition exists for good reason. We cannot simply discard it because the king's wolf reacted strongly to a particular young woman. With respect, Edmund, Margaret replied evenly. Tradition also exists to serve the well-being of our people, not merely for its own sake. I have watched the king these past weeks, watched the toll it took on him to suppress a bond his own wolf recognized so clearly. A king who rules from a place of suppressed longing and hollow duty serves his people poorly, regardless of how carefully his marriage aligns with political expectation. Sentiment, Edmund said dismissively, is a poor foundation for governance. And yet, Margaret countered, genuine devotion, properly channeled, has produced some of the strongest leaders our history remembers. I do not propose we discard tradition entirely, Edmund. I propose we recognize that tradition must sometimes bend to accommodate truths that cannot simply be reasoned away through careful political calculation. The debate continued for some time, elders voicing concerns and counter-arguments in equal measure, while Elena stood quietly beside Kellen, her nerves stretched thin with each passing exchange. She understood the significance of what was being decided, understood that regardless of the progress made with Ashwood the previous day, this particular question, whether the council would formally accept her as Kellen's mate, carried consequences that would shape the rest of her life. Finally, Edmund raised one final objection, his expression carrying genuine concern rather than simple stubbornness. Even if we accept the king's choice, what of the girl herself? She holds no noble lineage, no particular skill in leadership or diplomacy that would prepare her for the responsibilities a queen must carry. Are we truly prepared to place such weight upon someone with no formal training for the role? Before Margaret could respond, Elena found herself stepping forward, surprising even herself, with the sudden surge of courage that propelled her to speak, without waiting for permission. May I address that concern directly? The chamber fell into surprised silence, elders exchanging startled glances at the unusual sight of an Omega addressing the council so directly. Kellen glanced toward her, his expression carrying quiet encouragement despite his own evident surprise, and Margaret, after a brief hesitation, nodded for her to continue. I understand your concern, Elena said, her voice trembling slightly at first, before steadying as she continued. I was not raised expecting to hold any position of leadership. I spent my life mending clothes and staying quietly out of matters that did not concern me, exactly as I was taught an Omega should behave. But I have watched, throughout my life within this pack, how leadership actually functions, not simply through formal training and diplomacy, but through genuine care for the people one is responsible for. I have tended to warriors' torn uniforms after difficult battles. I have listened to the worries of kitchen staff and stable hands, people whose concerns rarely reach a council chamber like this one. I may lack formal training in the particular skills you value, but I do not lack understanding of what it means to genuinely care for the well-being of people, often overlooked by those in power. She paused, gathering her courage before continuing. If given the opportunity, I would commit myself fully to learning whatever formal skills the role requires, but I would also bring something perhaps equally valuable, a genuine understanding of what it means to live without power, without privilege, to be among the very people this council is meant to serve. I believe that understanding could serve Blackthorn well, if the council is willing to give me the chance to prove it. Silence stretched through the chamber following her words, elders exchanging thoughtful glances, several expressions softening in ways Elena had not anticipated. Even Edmund appeared to consider her words seriously, his stern expression carrying something closer to reluctant respect rather than immediate dismissal. Margaret finally broke the silence, a small, approving smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Well spoken, Elena. Perhaps more wisdom exists in your perspective than this council initially credited." She turned to address the full gathering, her voice carrying clear authority. "I move that the council formally recognize Elena as King Kellen's chosen mate, with the understanding that appropriate guidance and preparation will be provided to help her fulfill the responsibilities such a role requires." The council moved to vote, and Elena held her breath as elder after elder raised their hands in support of Margaret's motion, until finally, even Edmund, after a long, considering pause, added his own reluctant approval to the growing consensus. When the final count was announced, the motion had passed with clear, decisive support, and Elena felt the tension that had gripped her chest for days finally begin to loosen its hold. Kellen turned to her immediately, his expression breaking into open, unguarded joy, and without waiting for further formality, he pulled her into a warm embrace right there in the center of the council chamber, uncaring of the many eyes watching their unguarded display of affection. "We did it," he whispered against her hair, relief and happiness mixing together in his voice. "We did it," Elena echoed softly, allowing herself, finally, to fully believe that the impossible future they had both fought so desperately to secure was truly, at last, within reach. But even as celebration began spreading through the chamber, congratulations offered by council members who had so recently debated against her very presence, Elena noticed Margaret's expression carrying a final note of seriousness that suggested one significant step still remained before their story could truly be considered complete. "There remains the matter of the formal claiming ceremony," Margaret said, once the initial excitement had settled somewhat. "Tradition requires that an Alpha King publicly claim his chosen mate before the full pack, a ceremony that binds wolf and mate together permanently, witnessed by the community both are meant to serve. Given the unusual circumstances surrounding this particular match, I would suggest performing this ceremony as soon as preparations allow, to ensure no further doubt or challenge can be raised regarding the legitimacy of your bond." Kellen glanced toward Elena, silently asking whether she felt ready for what remained ahead, and Elena, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his gaze, nodded with quiet, growing confidence. "Let's not wait any longer," she said softly. "I'm ready." The preparations for the ceremony moved quickly once the decision had been made. Word spread rapidly through Blackthorn, carried by excited whispers that traveled from cabin to cabin, far faster than any formal announcement could manage. Elena found herself swept into a whirlwind of activity over the following 2 days, fitted for a simple but elegant dress by Grace and several other women from the kitchens, who had heard the news and eagerly volunteered their help, their earlier sympathy now transformed into genuine excitement for the celebration ahead. She barely recognized herself in the small mirror propped against her cabin wall on the morning of the ceremony, dressed in soft blue fabric that Grace had carefully embroidered with delicate silver thread along the sleeves, her dark hair braided with small white flowers gathered from the fields surrounding the camp. The nervous flutter in her stomach had not fully faded, but beneath it now lived a steady, growing certainty that whatever awaited her that day, she was ready to face it fully. Nora had traveled from the border settlement to witness the ceremony, having received Kellen's personal invitation, along with generous compensation for the journey, and her warm, familiar presence among the gathering crowd offered Elena a small, comforting connection to the difficult days of her exile, days that now felt like a distant memory against the joy building steadily within her chest. The entire pack gathered in the open field beyond the training grounds as afternoon approached, warriors and kitchen staff and elders alike assembling in respectful anticipation of the ceremony about to unfold. Even several Ashwood representatives remained to witness the event, their presence a quiet testament to the successful negotiations that had unfolded over the preceding days. Serafina stood among them, her expression carrying genuine warmth as she caught Elena's eye across the gathered crowd, offering a small, encouraging smile that Elena gratefully returned. Kellen waited at the center of the field, dressed in formal dark clothing that somehow made him look even more striking than she remembered, his storm gray eyes finding hers immediately as she began the slow walk across the field toward him, Margaret walking respectfully beside her to formally present her before the assembled pack. The ceremony itself carried a simple, ancient beauty that Elena had witnessed only from a distance throughout her life, watching other couples bond before the pack while she remained on the outskirts, never imagining she would one day stand at the very center of such a ceremony herself. Margaret spoke the traditional words, her voice carrying clearly across the silent, attentive crowd, describing the sacred nature of the bond about to be formed, the responsibility both parties accepted toward each other, and toward the pack they were sworn to serve together. When it came time for Kellen to speak his own vows, he took both of Elena's hands in his eyes never leaving hers, as he spoke words that carried far more weight than mere tradition required. "From the moment I first saw you," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath the surface, "my wolf recognized something in you that I did not yet fully understand myself. I have spent every day since fighting to protect what that recognition meant, fighting against tradition, against fear, against every obstacle that stood between us. I choose you, Elena, not because circumstances forced this choice upon me, but because there has never been any other choice my heart was truly willing to make. I promise to stand beside you, to learn from you, to build a future worthy of everything you have already sacrificed to reach this moment with me." Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes as she listened, and when it came time for her own vows, she found the words flowing easily, despite the nervous flutter that had accompanied her throughout the morning's preparations. "I never imagined a story like this could belong to someone like me," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly despite its gentle tone. "I spent my life believing I was meant to remain invisible, unremarkable, someone whose voice mattered little, beyond the small tasks assigned to her. You saw something different in me from the very beginning, and though I fought against believing it myself for longer than I probably should have, I understand now that some bonds are simply too strong to deny, regardless of what tradition or fear might argue otherwise. I choose you too, Kellen. Today, and every day that follows, for as long as we both shall live." The formal ceremony concluded with the traditional exchange of a woven cord around their joined wrists, a symbol of the permanent bond now formed between them, witnessed and blessed by the entire pack gathered around them. As Margaret pronounced the bond officially sealed, a great cheer rose from the assembled crowd, warriors and kitchen staff and elders alike celebrating openly, the earlier tension and uncertainty of recent weeks finally giving way to genuine, unrestrained joy. Kellen pulled Elena close, and as their lips met in a gentle, tender kiss before the entire pack, Elena felt something settle deep within her chest, a quiet, profound sense of belonging she had never fully experienced before this moment. The wolf that had called to her through countless dreams, the voice that had whispered her name through silver forests and moonlit longing, finally fell silent, not from absence, but from peaceful, complete fulfillment. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling the camp, as warriors and nobles alike joined in dancing and feasting to honor the newly formed bond between their king and his chosen mate. Elena moved through the celebration with a lightness she had never before experienced, greeting well-wishers who had once barely acknowledged her existence, accepting congratulations from elders who had, just days earlier, debated whether she was worthy of the very role she now formally held. Grace found her during a quiet moment away from the dancing, pulling her into a warm, tearful embrace. "I always knew you deserved happiness, Elena. I'm so glad you finally found it." "Thank you for everything," Elena replied, squeezing Grace's hands warmly. "For your kindness, your friendship, all of it. I couldn't have survived these past weeks without people like you." Later that evening, as the celebration began winding down and stars scattered brightly across the clear night sky, Kellen found Elena standing quietly at the edge of the field, watching the last of the dancing continue near the great hall. He came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as she leaned into his warmth. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, watching her carefully. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking back over everything that had led them to this moment. The fear and uncertainty of those early weeks, the pain of exile, the desperate hope that had carried her through her darkest days at the border settlement. "None," she finally said, a genuine peaceful smile spreading across her face. "Every difficult moment led us here, to exactly where we were always meant to be. I promise you, Kellen said quietly, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead, that whatever challenges still await us, as we build this new future together, I will face them with you, exactly as I should have from the very beginning. Elena turned to look up at him, her heart full with a happiness she had once believed impossible for someone like her to ever fully claim. Together, she agreed softly. Above them, the stars continued their quiet watch over the celebrating camp, silent witnesses to a bond that had defied tradition and fear alike, to finally find its rightful place beneath the open sky. The wolf that had called her name through countless restless nights had finally found the answer it sought, and as Kellen and Elena stood together at the edge of the celebration, watching the last embers of the evening fires glow warmly against the darkness, both of them understood, with quiet, unwavering certainty, that whatever the future held, they would face it exactly as they had fought so hard to remain, together, and completely unwilling to ever let each other go again. The kingdom that had once demanded careful calculation over genuine feeling would, in time, come to understand that the strongest alliances are built not merely through political convenience, but through leaders brave enough to honor both duty and devotion in equal measure. And in the years that followed, as Elena grew steadily into her role beside Kellen, earning the genuine respect of council and commoner alike, through the same quiet strength and compassion that had first drawn his wolf to her across a crowded training ground, Blackthorn flourished under their combined leadership, a testament to the enduring truth that some bonds, once formed, prove strong enough to reshape even the oldest and most rigid of traditions. And every night, as Elena drifted toward sleep beside the man who had once been forbidden to love her, she no longer needed dreams of silver forests and distant howls to feel the presence of the wolf who had called her name so faithfully. Through every trial they had overcome together, he was simply there, beside her, exactly where he belonged, his heartbeat steady and sure against her own, a quiet promise fulfilled at last.